Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on the history and philosophy of social sciences. This is going to be the first in a sequence of supplementary lecture material that I'm adding to my University of Toronto course on the philosophy of social sciences. I decided to post these publicly on my YouTube channel so that the general public may also learn about and discuss this material in the comments section below if they so choose. A few disclaimers before we begin. The first thing is that we're going to be focusing entirely upon Western social sciences, so this includes economics, sociology, psychology, and anthropology. Secondly, we will be focusing on so-called Western social sciences as opposed to Eastern, African, Latin American, Native American, etc. So I don't make any claims to know much about those fields. That's why I'm focusing mostly upon American and European forms of social science in the past 2,000 odd years. Thirdly, because we are focusing on 2,000 years of material, I can't discuss all of this. So I'm going to be biased in choosing certain ideas, key methods, and key figures in that history, and you'll have to forgive me for choosing those figures. Lastly, if you have any questions or concerns, you're welcome to email me in the email provided in the description box at the bottom below this video. All right, without further ado, let's begin. All right, so let's just begin with a bit of a general overview of our discussion today. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the history of the social sciences. The second is we're going to describe the distinction between so-called qualitative methods in the social sciences and quantitative methods in the social sciences. Then we're going to talk about the usage and abuses of values in social science. Then we will talk about things like social constructionism, which I'll describe what that means later on. Things like propensities and different kinds of social ontologies, which again I will describe what that means later on. This notion of reflexivity and questions of reduction and emergence in the methodologies of the social sciences. Okay, we're going to start off our discussion with the ancient Greek period. So this is the Mediterranean region. And the first thing to notice about this period, which is roughly spanning from 5th century BCE until about 200 or so BCE, is that in this time period, we're looking at a lack of division between the social sciences. So there's this holistic integration of the social sciences under the banner of political philosophy. And the reason for this is because the division between the individual social sciences into anthropology, economics, sociology, psychology, etc., didn't exist until the modern period from the 1600s onwards. And so rather you just had so-called philosophers, who are people who are general intellectuals, who are interested in general theories, holistically understood, of human nature and of the cosmos at large. So that also includes the natural sciences. So the first figure that we're going to look at is Aristotle. Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher active in the 4th century BCE, famous for his work in logic, obviously politics, hence his book Politics, and for providing different accounts of ethics and human nature in general. And so Aristotle would introduce the term oikonomia, which means basically management of the household. And so the term economics actually comes from this Greek word oikonomia. At the time, a lot of the natural sciences, mostly applied mathematics and physics and aspects of chemistry and biology, though those weren't quite as prominent, had applications in the mathematics of farming and family planning. And so you're going to see this integration between natural scientific thinking and social scientific thinking in the context of sociological considerations with respect to, do we have enough food? How are we going to feed our soldiers? How are we going to regulate family planning and births? And how are we going to wage wars? These sorts of things. And most importantly, how is it that we're going to retain social cohesion? So social cohesion theories are really important this time because you want to make sure that people in positions of power do not become subjected to rebellions and other sorts of conflicts. Okay, we're now going to jump about 1,000 odd years into the medieval and Islamic Golden Age period. In this period, there were mostly developments in mathematics and in the natural sciences. So things like the conception of algorithm and algebra, which are Arabic terms, the invention of a numeral system, and things like developments in astronomy, planetary motion, etc. So those are the kind of main natural scientific developments that were made in this period. But what was also happening, of course, were developments in the fine arts, such as literature, music, dance, poetry, etc. And attendant with this was developments in social science as well, though there weren't quite as many developments in social science, which is why I'm only focusing on two figures that concern our discussion today. The first is St. Thomas Aquinas, who's an Italian Catholic theologian and natural philosopher, active in the 13th century. So we'll talk a bit about his conception of just price. And the second figure we'll talk about is a 14th century Islamic thinker, Ibn Khaldun, mostly working in demography, historical methodology, and proto-sociology. So both of them are united by their interest in, of course, religious matters. And before we get to that, we have to describe the distinction between normative and descriptive claims. So what are normative claims? Normative claims are descriptions about how we would like things to be, how things ought to be. That's very different than making a descriptive claim, which is telling us how the world in fact actually is. So I'll use a very simple example. This is a water bottle. This is a descriptive claim. I'm saying that there's a water bottle in front of me. A normative claim would be, I should drink water out of the water bottle. Now notice that the normative claim doesn't have to follow from the descriptive claim. Maybe I'm already had enough water, so I'm not thirsty anymore, in which case I shouldn't drink further water from the water bottle. But that should claim is very different than a descriptive claim, because a descriptive claim is saying a matter of fact versus how things should be. So maybe there's a matter of fact that there was slavery for thousands of years. That doesn't mean that it should be the case. It's a very different sort of claim. And so I mention this because when we discuss a bit about the Quran and the Bible and the position on usury, that we're going to be talking about the blurring of the distinction between normative and descriptive. So the blurring of the distinction is very important in this time period because later social sciences tend to separate normative from descriptive claims. So let's just use the example of usury. So what is usury? Usury is a financial and economic term that concerns the charging of interest on loans. So if I lend you $100 and I say you got to give me interest on that loan, so you got to pay me not only $100 back, but you got to pay me 5%, let's say 2 months from now, that is charging interest on a loan and therefore charging usury. So in the Quran and in the Old and New Testament, in certain passages, they make very clear that charging interest on loans is completely unethical. Okay, so there is a blending of the normative and the descriptive claims here because the theory at the time, which is very popular, is that there's the normative claim, namely that you should not, it's a should claim, not a statement of fact, that you should not engage in usury because they consider it immoral. And the descriptive claim is that it would lead humans to be deviant and to be corrupt and to be selfish, etc. So that's also a descriptive claim about the social behavior of human beings. Hence, the blurring of the normative and descriptive distinction is starting to be blurred in this case. So they're making both claims simultaneously. So what is Thomas Aquinas's contribution to this discussion? Well, he's talking mostly about this idea of just price. So what is a just price? Well, suppose, for example, we're on a Craigslist transaction, or maybe we're just bartering for lemonade on the streets, and I want to charge you lemonade for $15 US. You might think that's a lot of money. That's an unjust price, considering that lemonade materials are very cheap. You can get plastic cups at Walmart for cheap. You can get lemons from a grocery store such as Safeway for very cheap, etc. It seems an unjust price. It also seems unjust in some sense if I just gave lemonade away to you for free. It's unjust because I'm not being rewarded for paying for the input capital expenditure costs that go into my lemonade business, for example. And so the idea of a just price, which Thomas Aquinas is introducing, is very much, again, a blurring of the distinction between normative and descriptive theory. So he had various thoughts about what should be considered a just price. And essentially, his theory is that it should be considered the average market price. So if you deviate too far amongst the local market for the good or service from the average price, that should be considered unjust. As to assigning a quantitative measure to what is an unjust price, that is very much unclear unless you're an Aquinas scholar. If you do happen to know, please leave a comment in the chat below. I'm just not an expert on that. So Ibn Khaldun I don't know as much about, but I do know that he was very important in the history of demography. Demography would be things like population statistics, birth rate statistics, mortality statistics, etc. He was also very active in historical methodology, so how should history be done? Should history be done through oral history, through the telling of stories? Should history be done through the writing of texts and the reading of primary source texts that were present in a historical time period well before the historian is analyzing that time? And there's also discussion of proto-sociological views about the influence of race, sex, and gender on society, and class struggle and political power. So Ibn Khaldun was a major figure in the history of Islamic social scientific thinking of the 14th century. Exiting the medieval period and Islamic Golden Age times, we're going to be looking at the 17th century. So the 17th century is known as the early modern period. The early modern period is very important to the history of science, both natural and social sciences, because it's the beginning of the so-called Enlightenment period. So we're going to discuss mostly people in the social sciences, but we'll discuss a little bit about influential philosophers in Western philosophy that also had a prominent methodological influence on social scientists. So the first figure we're going to discuss is a man named Bernard Mandeville. So Bernard Mandeville was active mostly in the early 18th century, in the 1700s. And Bernard Mandeville had a descriptive theory that described that of human behavior interactions with respect to economic transactions. So his basic thought is that humans are by nature, it's a very pessimistic view, which you don't have to agree with, but humans are by nature full of vices. So we're selfish, we're corrupt, we have little regard and altruism for that of other people, we just think for ourselves, this sort of thing. So he's not saying we're always like this, but he says we have a tendency to do this, especially when times are tough. And as a consequence, he thinks that the beauty of something like capitalism, again, you don't need to agree with this, but the beauty of something like capitalism is that it allows people to put aside their vices, etc., in order to stimulate innovation, growth, and capital movement. So the basic thought here, so you might think, well, wait a second, doesn't capitalism, there seems to be a lot of evidence that capitalism is actually very destructive. It's very aspects of selfishness, a lot of greed, a lot of corruption, etc., in the economic structure. Well, his idea is that it's better than actually going to war with each other. So the alternative is that we have these conflicts in physical combat and through war, as opposed to having combat in the market. So if we have competition for producing goods and services, that is a better way, again, assuming the very pessimistic view of human nature that he has, it's a better way of living than it would be for us to fight each other. So this is important because the beauty and the rise spontaneously of capitalism in the 15 and 1600s or so, mostly in Europe, with the first stock trading organization being in the Netherlands in the early 1600s, arose because of a mutual interest in avoiding vices as opposed to stimulating that of virtuous transactions. So it's not about courage, it's not about altruism, etc., that allows us to stimulate a market economy. It's rather the fact that engaging in economic transactions allows us to peacefully exchange goods and services as opposed to engaging in war with each other. The next figure we're going to look at is François Quesnay. François Quesnay is a French physiocrat. A physiocrat is a movement of French intellectuals in the 18th century, mostly interested in social sciences such as sociology, political science, and most importantly, economics. And so François Quesnay was a big influence on Adam Smith, which is why it's important to mention him. We'll discuss Adam Smith in just a moment. And Quesnay's basic thought here is that the entirety of the value of an economy is based upon its agricultural productivity. So we're looking at wheat, we're looking at fertilizer, we're looking at corn, we're looking at fruits and vegetables, we're looking at livestock, cattle, sheep, etc. And the reason that agriculture is so important is that the value of a society is based entirely upon agriculture insofar as we need food to exist. So without food, you're not going to be able to produce things like cars, you're not going to be able to produce things like telephones, satellites, the internet, etc. And so François Quesnay had a tableau économique, which is French for an economic tableau, economic table of sorts, that outlines the dynamical flow of surplus value in economic exchange, beginning with agriculture and flowing through into land, into other aspects of industry, into other aspects of the economy at large. The next figure we'll discuss is David Hume. So David Hume is a Scottish philosopher, most famous for raising the problem of induction, amongst other things, and proto-thinker on the philosophy of science and scientific method. But in the context of social science, David Hume had a treatise on human nature, and he also had water theories of economics. So a treatise on human nature is to be understood as one of the first texts in what you would now call psychology, but at the time was just called philosophy of mind. And so gave an account on human nature, described the emotions, how the emotions interact with our rational sides of our brain, logical thinking, etc. But with respect to the water theories of economics, which I think are more interesting to discuss right now, is that he described things like the price-specie flow mechanism. So what does that mean? So let's use a highly simplified example, okay? So it's a kind of false idealization, but it helps you to try to model global trade and tariffs, etc. So the basic thought is that when a company has a country has a low exchange rate, that will stimulate demand for goods and services into that economy. So look at China, for example. The Chinese renminbi and yuan is worth a lot less than the US dollar, for example, and that stimulates purchasing of goods and services into China. What this does is it allows a country like China to become more wealthy. So how does this relate to David Hume's theory? Well, the idea is that it's sort of like the ebbing and flowing of water. So where there's kind of a place that has a large volume of empty space, water can flow into that compared to a place that has too much value and surplus value and a higher exchange rate in another place. So the idea is that water is a metaphor for the exchange of economic value through different countries through trade deficits and trade net benefits. Adam Smith, well, Adam Smith is a contemporary of David Hume, and Adam Smith is important because Adam Smith is considered one of the intellectual founders of theories of capitalism. So capitalism, of course, existed for a very long time. It grew kind of spontaneously out of the 15th and 16th centuries, leading into especially its explosion in the 17th century in Europe. But Adam Smith, writing in the 1800s, famous for his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, is going to be a landmark text describing theories of capital movement, mostly the labor theory of value. So the labor theory of value is going to be the theory of value that describes why it is that, for example, a computer, which is the computer right in front of me, is worth so much more than, for example, this water bottle. And the basic thought is that the amount of labor that's required to produce semiconductors, transistors, etc. in this computer is significantly more than that of something like a water bottle. Again, this might sound very intuitive, but there are arguably certain counterintuitive consequences that follow from this very simple idea, of which Adam Smith outlined in The Wealth of Nations. We unfortunately don't have time to get into that. You would have to watch another YouTube video on the Wealth of Nations, of which there are many. But I do want to describe briefly how Adam Smith synthesized Bernard Mandeville and David Hume's theories of economics into a theory of a capital development. And so that basic theory is going to go like this. There's going to be a moral psychology, that is the theory of the sentiments and the theory of emotions and the theory of moral behavior. And there's also going to be a descriptive theory about capital flow. So he gets both of these elements and inspiration from Bernard Mandeville, Francois Quesnay, and as well as David Hume. And so in this basic theory, you're going to have a theory that describes the famous invisible hand idea. So the invisible hand theory basically says that it's not from the benevolence or the altruism of the butcher that allows you to get the meat that you have, whether it be the steak, etc., that you have in the morning. That's not what it is that allows you to have that. What actually allows you to have that is actually from people pursuing their own self-interest. So when I say self-interest, I want to distinguish self-interest from that of selfishness. Adam Smith is not saying that everyone is selfish. Rather, he is saying that people are self-interested, that they have goals and preferences for themselves and for their family members and their friends that may or may not conflict with that of other people. And so instead of us thinking about, what would it be the case that the stranger wants outside, or what is it the case that Prime Minister here in Canada, Justin Trudeau, might want, or maybe some celebrity or some other random person, if you just think about yourself and you try to do things that are best for you, Adam Smith thinks that if everyone is operating in this kind of fashion, that it's more likely that you're going to have a harmonious economic system. And so this is the idea that the invisible hand, everyone just following their individual actions, can nonetheless spontaneously generate economic order. So it allows you to have things like fair prices. It allows you to have supply and demand mechanism that can be adjusted by prices. And it allows you to have an exchange of goods and services that would be much more efficient than if everyone was purely trying to be altruistic or trying to think too much about other people. And you might think, well, what are you talking about? I mean, aren't I concerned about other people? Don't I think about other people when I, choose to ride a bicycle as opposed to drive a car because I'm concerned about environmental damage, et cetera, et cetera? Sure. He grants aspects of this sort of thinking, but the basic point is that in the context of economic transactions, what's probably better off is that you can't know about everyone else's preferences. You can only know about your own preferences. It's a lot more difficult without survey data, et cetera, of which there wasn't technology at the time, to calculate what it is that other people's preferences are. So if you just focus on your own preferences, then you would be led to make wiser social and economic decisions. And the last figure we're going to describe on this slide is a figure named Hegel. So Hegel is an 18th century German philosopher. There's so much to say about Hegel, but I got to make it quick. So basically, Hegel is a philosopher in the so-called German idealism tradition, beginning with Immanuel Kant, going into the works of Fichte and Schelling, and then ending with Hegel. So this is a so-called German idealism period because they're influenced by the idealism philosophy of figures like George Berkeley, amongst others. Now, Hegel's influence on social science is particularly prominent in the context of political theory, as well as being one of the principal influences for Karl Marx. So everyone has heard of Karl Marx, well-known German and naturalized British economist and political theorist of sorts. And Hegel's influence is mostly with respect to his philosophy of history. So in this philosophy of history, you have this description about the extent at which history has a telos, that is, it has a set of goals and it has this natural progression of which history engages in. And it's mostly through this dialectical process of conflict. And in doing so, Hegel was very influential on Marx's conception of capitalism. So we thought that capitalism engages in a dialectic between the proletariat, that is the working class, and a sequence of landowners and factory owners and capitalists who are the dominant class that oppress that of the underclass proletariat. Transitioning away from Germany just for a moment, we're going to focus on a few French and Belgian thinkers. We're going to look at the rise of sociology as a discipline, mostly in the late 18th century. So that is late 1700s, early 19th century. So Henri de Saint-Simon was a defender of so-called epistocracy. So what is an epistocracy? An epistocracy is from the Greek word epistemology, which is of or pertaining to knowledge, and cracy is kind of a suffix that is supposed to represent a mode of government. So epistocracy is going to be a mode of government by ruling intellectual elites. So not just any elites, but specifically those that are academics, philosophers, etc., who are going to be the intellectual elites. So Henri de Saint-Simon thought that people, the average people, are not very educated, they're dumb, they don't make good decisions. Again, you don't need to agree with any of this. This was just his idea. And that why are we making them make the decisions when we should have people who are in positions of power, who are educated, etc.? And so Henri de Saint-Simon would be very influential on figures like Auguste Comte, which we'll discuss in a moment, and the idea that social sciences are supposed to develop policy recommendations and directives. So if you want to adjust things like immigration, for example, you want to set central banking interest rates, if you want to describe what the target birth rate should be, etc., you should have a system of intellectual elites, whether it be university professors, etc., who are going to be calling the shots. The next figure we're going to discuss is Adolphe Quetelet. Adolphe Quetelet is a Belgian astronomer and social scientist of sorts. He was very active in what we would now describe as eugenics. So eugenics is, there's two kinds, positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is theories about how and what kinds of human beings we should have and procreate. So with respect to physical characteristics and also mental characteristics. He was also big in aspects of negative eugenics. So negative eugenics is the much more famous variant of eugenics that you've probably heard of, which includes sterilization and mass killing, for example. So the Nazis were most famous for practicing negative eugenics. Adolphe Quetelet was very active in producing statistical theories in medicine and astronomy. So his legacy is most well known by the general public with respect to body mass index measures. So that's an index measure of your weight with respect to your height. And in the history of science, Quetelet was very influential in criminological theory. So criminological theory is what it sounds like. It's a theory of what it is that allows and fosters deviancy in criminal behavior. And so it was really popular at the time to have theories of witchcraft or phrenology, which is skull structures that's supposed to describe the probabilities that you commit crimes, etc., because they didn't have genetics at the time, right? So they had to look to other sources of alleged evidence in order to provide a theory for when it is that a person's going to commit a crime, what kinds of people are going to commit crimes, etc., etc., etc. So Adolphe Quetelet was a major figure in developing criminology and sociology into a social science at this time. Probably the most influential figure of this earlier period is Auguste Comte. He was a French social scientist and philosopher of sorts. And he had a basic idea that social sciences should be something like an extension of the natural sciences. In fact, a lot of these figures at the time thought so. Adolphe Quetelet also thought this. So he applied the statistical methods from astronomy and brought them into criminology and into eugenics. Auguste Comte's legacy in the history of sociology is mostly with respect to this idea of the three stages of which humanity goes through. So humanity typically goes through, that is, human cultures go through a theological period in which there's deference to supernatural entities and religious authorities, a secondary phase known as a metaphysical phase, which is a transition into a positivistic phase. So the metaphysical phase is going to be theories about that are more secularized, and they're going to focus more on the nature of reality broadly understood that are not as beholden to aspects of religious intellectuals and religious leaders. Positivism is going to be the scientific method as we understand it today. So he thinks that there's kind of this general trend, this general telos, you could say, goal-directedness that the history of human cultures trends towards, that goes through this theological phase initially into a metaphysical phase and then finally into a so-called positivistic phase. Other sociologists of his time actually disagreed. So Émile Durkheim is a good example. So Émile Durkheim is a French sociologist most famous for writing a monograph called Suicide in 1899, which is on the phenomenon of suicide. And in this text, he's most famous for advocating, among other things, various theories about why it is that people commit suicide, what times of year, what job classes, what ethnic groups, and what is the distinction between suicide, murder, various other factors that pertain to the death of people. And Durkheim's influence on sociology was particularly influential philosophically on this idea of holism versus individualism. So what does this mean? So holism means that social phenomena occur holistically. So you might think, well, okay, isn't that obvious? I mean, social phenomena by definition includes multiple people. So there are groups of people. What do you mean? What's to make this holistic? Well, the holism aspect is that you can't understand certain phenomena unless you understand multiple aspects of the totality of that phenomena understood as a whole, as opposed to breaking it up into parts. So consider political conflict or maybe a soccer riot. To use an example from my time growing up in Vancouver, Canada, there was the so-called Stanley Cup riots 10 odd years ago. And if you wanted to understand the Stanley Cup riots, you could look at the individual neuronal arrangements of each individual's brain. You could do that kind of analysis, or you could look at a psychological theory, but that won't be very helpful. A much more obvious explanation for it is that the Vancouver Canucks, which is the hockey team, lost the Stanley Cup, and that caused people to get really upset. So taking a more holistic, macroscopic approach of the phenomenon and what leads to this kind of behavior, what led to ordinary Vancouver citizens to trash and destroy aspects of businesses in the downtown core, is that you need to take a holistic analysis of what it is that's happening. Excuse me. So in that sense, Durkheim is an anti-individualist. He thinks that it's not as important as if one were to take a psychological theory that focuses on each individual's thoughts and beliefs, because this is emergent phenomena, soccer riots, for example, or hockey riots, and things like political protests. So Durkheim is very influential in sociological methodology understood in that sense. The last figure we'll discuss in the history of classical sociology is Max Weber. So Max Weber is a German intellectual, philosopher, social scientist, and economic historian. Max Weber is most famous for advocating a thesis known as the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And that book is a theory that states that the rise of capitalism is a rise because of individualistic thinking in the context of Protestant theology and thinking as opposed to Catholic thinking. And Max Weber would introduce this idea of so-called ideal types. So ideal types are going to be, when advocating a sociological theory, you might have a prototypical idea of what a human being is, where that prototypical idea doesn't actually capture that of any individual human being, but just captures kind of a general average human being. So it's very important in social sciences that you make idealizations to simplify calculations and simplify your model. If your model is entirely where the map equals the territory, that is, reality just simply fully equals your model, it'll be so complicated and so unwieldy that you won't be able to have any methodological traction over predicting or explaining sociological phenomena. Rather, you need to make a simplified model. And physicists do this all the time. Epidemiologists do this all the time to model COVID. Sociologists do this all the time to model things like race, gender, sex, etc. when it comes to looking at income disparities, wealth inequality, and political conflicts. So Max Weber was very influential in articulating certain models of so-called ideal types, that is, certain kinds of average models of average human beings. Max Weber also produced a very influential definition of what a modern nation state is. And so this modern nation state idea is going to be defined as a country or a place is defined as a state if and only if there exists at least one set of group actors that functions as a legitimate monopoly on the usage of violence. Okay, so I'm going to say that one more time just so you understand. A state is that entity such that there exists some subgroup of those people in that society where these people have a monopoly on legitimate violence. So in plain English, what does this mean? This means that a state exists only if there are police. And not only if they're police, but if the police are in some sense granted legitimacy to administer and uphold and enforce laws. This is a very important conception of what a nation state is. So if you think about in the history of humanity, there was a time in which there was no police. There were no group of people to ensure that laws were enforced, etc. So Max Weber thinks, as a kind of proto-political scientific theory, that nation states can only form if there is a legitimate monopoly on violence that is understood to be so by average citizens. Having discussed a bit about economics and sociology, we have to talk a bit about the history of psychology as well. So the history of psychology is interesting because, in a sense, there always was a history of psychology. Why? Because there was a field known as philosophy of mind. So philosophy of mind was continuous with philosophical traditions going back to Aristotle onwards, and they're basically just general theories of the mind. What makes psychology a science as opposed to merely philosophy of mind is that there were empirical methods, that is, ways of testing hypotheses. So in philosophy of mind, there wasn't clear methods to test and refute and accept different forms of hypotheses about how the mind is structured and how the mind works. So the history of psychology is mostly a European endeavor arising in two countries in particular, Germany and England. So Gustav Fechner was a German psychologist who advocated mathematical precision and statistical inference methods in psychological practice. So Fechner is known for the so-called Fechner-Weber law. So the Fechner-Weber law is a logarithmic curve that describes the extent at which the intensity of some phenomenon tends to actually decrease in its increments as the intensity increases. So let's just use a really simple example. I know that was a lot of very complicated speaking. Let's just use a simple example to illustrate the point. So to use an example, there's a bigger difference when I lightly put my finger on my skin than if I were to already press hard and then try to press even harder. So if I was already pressing hard and I press even harder, that difference is not as noticeable as is the difference between not having any contact at all with my arm and putting contact on my arm. That difference is arguably much larger than is the difference after I've already pressed hard and I'm pressing even harder. So Gustav Fechner is a figure who advocated a mathematical model for the so-called rate of intensity and the extent, excuse me, not the rate of intensity, the intensity of a stimulus with respect to its felt sensation that you feel yourself. Alexander Bain is an important figure because he was an editor of the journal Mind. So Mind was one of the first psychology journals to have ever been created in the history of psychology, and this is going to be in the 19th century, the 1800s. Nowadays, Mind is known as a so-called analytic philosophy journal. So for academic philosophers, you know what I'm talking about. Mind is known as a journal that does no longer publish work on psychology and philosophy of mind exclusively. It focuses primarily upon things like logic, philosophy of language, and other aspects of analytic philosophy, including metaphysics. Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt is one of the first to advocate the rise of the psych lab. So the idea that you have subjects that you bring into a laboratory, you ask questions to, and you do studies on them is very much a Wundtian idea. So Wundt was a German thinker in the 19th century. He also advocated a theory known as structuralism, which is very influential on his student Edmund Titchener. So Edmund Titchener was well known for advocating a manual for introspection and for trying to teach his subjects to introspect more closely. So what is introspection? Introspection is the idea that if you want to analyze your own experiences, you have to analyze yourself. So instead of having someone else analyze your behavior, you try your best to analyze yourself. Now you might think, well, don't we do that all the time? What's scientific about that? How does that help us to do anything? Well, Titchener's idea, which is quite interesting, is that when you bring someone into the psych lab and you want to do a study on them, if you teach that subject before they enter into the psych lab how to have better awareness of their own body and their mental states, whether it be what's troubling them, whether it be what makes them happy, whether it be how they perceive things, then that would allow the researcher who's a more expert on psychology to help the subject and study the subject and produce better data results. So this is kind of like if you were to study something, and then you have a novice or an amateur come in. If you teach them a bit beforehand, and then you kind of guide them when they start to come into the actual laboratory or the actual scenario that you want to engage in, that would allow you to expedite and make for a much smoother psychological study. So Titchener was very influential on this sort of method. Next, we turn to probably the most famous figure in the history of psychology, which is Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud was an Austrian intellectual, active primarily in Vienna, and he's most famous for his theory of psychoanalysis. This being said, Freud was actually trained as a neurologist of sorts, and he had medical training. So what is psychoanalysis? Well, I can't get into all of the details about what psychoanalysis is and is not, but I can say that psychoanalysis is a method of both therapy and of descriptive psychology. So it's a method of descriptive psychology because it's trying to understand the sources of our neuroses and mental illnesses. So suppose you're having trouble sleeping, suppose you have sexual deviancy issues, suppose that you're depressed, suppose that you're having hallucinations. Psychoanalysis is a method that is intended to try to help you get over those problems. And psychoanalysis is a therapeutic method in which you are to attend the therapist's office and you're to engage in a sequence of questioning and asking from a registered or approved Freudian psychoanalyst. And participant to this kind of method is very much an emphasis on the development of your own psychology and your life experiences. So we're looking at things like early family history. How did your father teach you? How did your mother treat you? How was the general social environment? Another core component of psychoanalysis is taking the analysis of dreams very seriously. So I'll use one example, forgive the crudity, but it is an example that he uses in his text, The Interpretation of Dreams. Freud talks about how if you dream about a tree and there's a branch and that branch breaks off, then you're actually sexually repressed. You actually want to masturbate or have sex or something like this. How it is that he draws these connections, I'm no Freud expert, you would have to read more. But many modern psychologists do criticize Freud for having untestable hypotheses, in some cases empirically false hypotheses, and thirdly for having metaphysical theories that are not very clearly scientific, at least by modern standards. That being said, there are many people who also continue to advocate Freudian psychoanalytical methods in therapy and in descriptive psychological practice. Freud is also famous for advocating the idea of the unconscious, right? So the unconscious is the idea that everything that you're aware of isn't all there is to your mind and your preferences and the things that you actually believe. So there's a so-called unconscious that operates to produce your motives and incentives for what it is that you do. There's also discussion of cultural theories. So Freud wrote a really wonderful book, strongly recommend this to everyone, called Civilization and Its Discontents. And he talks a lot about how it is that people aren't happy or how it is that people deal with their daily problems. And in doing so, where does this come from? And what is it that people are dissatisfied with? And in Freud's estimate, it's mostly sexual matters. And not only that, it's also the relationship that you have to your mother and your father in the early developmental stages. And if you think about this kind of theory, it's kind of a proto-sociological theory. So he's drawing upon culture. He's trying to understand Viennese society and why it is that so many people were having problems even though they were well off. Maybe they had a stable job, they had high income, etc. And just trying to produce a better picture of human nature. So Freud and his student Jung were very much participant to theories of human nature and human psychology at this time. So Jung is most famous for being, of course, the student of Sigmund Freud, but he also advocated two general theories. One is a theory of personality psychology by way of archetypes. So you have the archetypical alpha male, for example, or you have the beta male, or you have, all kinds of different personality characteristics. And these archetypes are important because everyone has a distinct archetype according to Jung. And these archetypes can help you to understand problems in your life. It can also help you to solve problems in your life. It can also help you to understand who's a good match for you romantically or sexually. Maybe it helps you to understand why it is that you have the political preferences you do, etc. Another theory that Jung advocated is called synchronicity. And synchronicity basically says, and this is a really drastic oversimplification, but synchronicity basically says something like there's a lot of coincidental events that happen. Maybe you've had coincidental events happen in your life. And Jung believes that there's some metaphysical force that maybe physics can or cannot understand. It's not clear in Jung. The extent at which people synchronize their thought patterns and beliefs and behaviors. So Jung thought that there's kind of this psychophysical force that's operating globally that connects minds to one another. Nowadays, this is not really accepted in modern psychology, nor in the modern natural social sciences, but it is an interesting theory nonetheless to think about. Returning back to the history of economic thought, we encounter the figure known as Karl Marx. Everyone has heard of Karl Marx. You've heard of communism. You've heard of Marxism. You've heard of this famous man with the big Santa Claus beard. So who is Karl Marx in a nutshell? Well, Karl Marx advocated communism, amongst other things. Communism is supposed to be a theory about economic and social relationships that avoid the oppressive class structures of capitalism. Communism has been practiced in numerous countries such as China, Russia, Cuba, aspects of Bolivia, those a failed attempt. You can describe Nicaragua as aspects of this. It depends on how you define communism and socialism. Karl Marx also advocated the so-called labor theory of value. So remember I said Adam Smith was a big advocate of the labor theory of value. What it is that allows a good or service to have the cost or value that it has is because of the amount of labor that goes into the entire supply chain generating that good or service. Karl Marx is less famous for, though he is more famous amongst historians of economics, for the thesis known as the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is a very important economic thesis that is not described enough by left-wing activists and political theorists. And the theory basically says that capitalism is actually doomed. It not only goes through this boom and bust cycle, whether it be through recessions and through speculative bull runs in the stock market, but capitalism also has this tendency for the rate of profit, that is the rate at which profits are accrued from the sale of goods and services, that there's a tendency for that rate to actually fall over time. In other words, Marx claimed, through an analysis of economic history, as well as various a priori, that is non-experimental methods and ideas and theories, that capitalism would eventually fall because it can't sustain the rate at which it continues to extract surplus labor and value from that of individual proletariat working class people. And so what this means is that capitalism will eventually fall. It will not be able to sustain profits. Companies like Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, etc., will not be able to sustain profits in the indefinite long term. And it's not even just about companies. It's the entire global economy that is the economic system of capitalism understood. Of course, capitalism at his time is very different than capitalism understood nowadays. Nowadays, we have a much more globalized society. We have all these free trade agreements. We have all these different kinds of currencies. We have respect for sovereign nation state boundaries comparatively to the 19th century. In the 19th century, in Marx's time, there was war, there was famine, there was lack of clear currency conversion rates, there was lack of clear methods of obtaining capital, taking interest in loans, etc. So capitalism from Marx's time is very different than it is nowadays. Marx is also known for his book Capital, and Capital has been published into multiple volumes, mostly Capital Volume 1, which he published in his time, 1867, and then other volumes such as Capital Volume 2 and Capital Volume 3. I obviously don't have enough time to describe the history of this book and its influence. It's as super interesting as it is, but the basic thought in Capital is that it's an economic history book. So when I say economic history, that's very different than talking about the history of economic thought. So the history of economic thought is what I'm doing for you guys right now. I'm giving you a history of major economists and thinkers on economics as a discipline. Economic history, by way of contrast, which is what Capital Volume 1 is all about, is a history of the actual economic happenings in a particular country or place. So if you actually take a look at Capital Volume 1, you'll actually see that it's a wonderfully detailed survey of the history of labor relations primarily in England, but also France, Germany, and to an extent Latin America and North America. And Capital Volume 1 is, of course, more than just an economic history book. It's also a theory book. It also advocates things like the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It advocates this base superstructure concept that's very popular in Marxist theory, which states that in order to understand culture, you have to first understand the economic relations that allow humans to engage with each other. So if you want to understand, for example, Sentinelese island people, which are known as people who have not yet had contact with civilization, that is the rest of civilized society. This is just an island south of India. If you want to understand these people, you have to look at their economic relations. If you want to understand United States people understood as an anthropological group, you need to look at their economic relations. How do they treat poor people? How do they deal with capital? How do they deal with loans? What kind of activity is happening in the stock market? And so if you want to understand beliefs, why it is that Italy remains a Catholic country, etc., you have to look at its labor relations and its economic power structures. So that's very much this idea of the base structure that is economics, socioeconomic class, influencing culture, art, power relations at the superstructure level. So Capital Volume 1 is an attempt to describe all those things in a single long book. Marx also advocates this teleological conception of history that was present in the work of Hegel. So this teleological conception of history is basically saying that humanity goes through a bunch of different stages, okay? Again, I don't agree necessarily with this, but this is just what Marx believed. He thought that initially there were hunter-gatherers, and then there's agricultural society when we discovered grain and methods for cultivating grain and crop rotation, etc. Then you go through a medieval feudal period in which you have monarchs or you have religious figures or a theocracy that is highly authoritarian, oppressive, non-democratic, and they control the kind of small ruling class elite, and they have exercise power over people below them. Then you go through a capitalism period, which is what is happening from the 1500s to the present time. And then you're supposed to go into a communism period, which avoids all the problems of the previous socioeconomic class structures. And this is where the distinction between your manager and the employee disappears. The employees own the means of production. There's much more equitable class structure. There's a lot less income inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Marx is also famous for advocating a theory of commodity fetishism and alienation. In the context of commodity fetishism, for example, you have this idea that why is it that we have so much materialism and goods and services? Like I have these headphones, for example, I have an MP3 player, I have an electric guitar, I have a refrigerator, I have a piano, I have a computer, I have all sorts of stuff. You yourself have tons of stuff. You probably maybe have a luxury car, maybe you have an iPad, maybe you have an iPhone. What is it about humans and commodities, and why do we fetishize them? Why are we so obsessed with them? Well, they're status symbols. They're not just status symbols, they're also practical objects of utility and use. But there is something about capitalism that fosters and engenders a kind of sequence and desire for status cultural goods. And so Marx is very critical of this. He thought that capitalism was really stupid because it incentivizes people to have false consciousness, to create false desires, completely ridiculous desires for things like Lamborghinis, Maserati cars, etc., for gold, for silver, for jewelry. And as opposed to more important things like maybe making friends or focusing on establishing peace with neighboring nation states or maybe having activity in arts and culture. So Marx wasn't wholesale necessarily against luxury goods, but he did think luxury goods are a negative externality generated from the capitalist system. Alienation is an important concept in Marx because if you're a wage laborer working at Starbucks, you hate your job. And not only that, you're selling coffee to people who make way more money than you. Or consider, for example, a blue-collar factory laborer in Ohio or someone working at the Ford factory in Detroit, Michigan. These people are paid very, very little money, right? They're paid minimum wage labor, in some cases a little bit more, and they're making cars for people and that, in some cases, they'll never even make enough money to drive some of these cars that they're considered so fancy. So consider Mercedes factory or Tesla factory, for example. And that's alienating because your labor is being alienated from the fruits of your labor, the thing that you're producing. Okay, and that's a very important theory in the sociological theory of how capitalism is structured, and this is very much a Marxist idea. Turning away from Marxist thought for a moment, we're going to look at other figures that were very prominent in the 1800s, that is the 19th century, in economic thought. We're going to focus on the so-called marginalist school of economics. This is very influential, perhaps more influential than Marx when it comes to economics as a science. And the reason for this is that Marx was very influential in political theory and in sociology, but less influential in terms of the analysis of class structure and socioeconomic relations in the context of capital goods in mainstream economics in the 20th century. That may be surprising to some of you because you might think, well, Marx, he thought so much about this. Well, it's just not the case that Marx has taught much in economics departments today. Whether you agree or disagree with that is totally up to you to decide, but I'm just telling you historically that that is the case. Rather, figures, such as Irving Fisher, William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, and Francis Ysidro Edgeworth were much more influential in their work in the so-called marginalist school of economic thinking. So what is the marginalist school of thought? This is kind of the beginnings of what is known as neoclassical economic thought arising out of the 19th century. So this is specifically in the 1870s. So you can pinpoint it to a very specific decade, about the 1870s or so. And in this decade, there was the rise of the idea of marginal utility. So what is marginal utility? We'll just use a simple example. So if I'm really hungry and I have one apple, then the satiation of my hunger increases a lot. Maybe it's not fully satiated by having the first bite as opposed to the 10th bite. Because when I have that first bite, that transition from being super hungry to having a little bit of satiation because I'm eating the apple, that's a much larger increase in utility than his subsequent increases in utility. So that's similar to the the Fechner-Weber law about stimulus that I was describing with respect to the haptic system. We're now talking about utility, that is the usefulness or the pleasure and happiness states that an individual economic agent is accruing from the consumption of good or service. So again, when I eat this apple, at first I'm like super hungry, and then I'm like way less hungry. So I go up to like, let's say 5 out of 10 utils. And then I take another bite, I increase by about like, let's say about 3 more utils. So I'm at 8 utility. Take another bite, I increase by 1 utility, I'm at 9. Take another bite, I'm at 9.5, let's suppose, so on and so forth. So with each subsequent bite, the amount of increase in utility decreases. So even though the cumulative utility increases, each subsequent marginal utility is starting to decrease. So for those who've studied a bit of calculus, you can describe the utility function as being such that it's logarithmically structured. That is, their first derivative is positive and the second derivative is negative. And this is really important because if you wanted to provide a mathematically and psychologically precise theory of microeconomic theory, that is how it is that goods and services prices are set relative to individual economic agents' preferences and utility functions, you would need to use calculus. And so this is why William Stanley Jevons is very influential in England as a progenitor of the application of calculus into microeconomic thinking. And Jevons is very much inspired by physics and astronomy. In fact, all 4 of these figures, Fisher, Jevons, Walras, and Edgeworth, were inspired by physics and its methods, particularly when it comes to so-called equilibrium reasoning. So if you haven't studied a bit of physics, I'll try to use a simple example. Consider, for example, a gas. So if you have a gas in a chamber, when you introduce that gas, or actually let's use an example, perfume. So suppose I spray a bit of perfume into my apartment. in this kind of general area of which I sprayed, first it's going to be quite pungent. You're going to smell the perfume, but over time it will dissipate. So the idea is that over time it will reach a time average of the system's amount of entropy, that is the disorder of that gas's dissipation amongst the entirety of the volume of my apartment room, for example. And in doing so, it's going to enter into an equilibrium state. It's going to enter into a state at which it doesn't fluctuate much at all. And so there's going to be a point at which the perfume kind of completely dissipates and all of its molecules will be so distributed in so many different parts of the room that you won't smell the perfume anymore. So this is very influential reasoning in classical mechanics, hydraulics, fluid mechanics, etc., and it's very important to the history of physics. And so figures like Fisher, Jevons, Volvers, Edgeworth in the marginal school of thought applied equilibrium reasoning to that of economic transactions as well. Specifically, they thought that there's going to be a supply and demand equilibrium. As supply increases, prices tend to increase and demand tends to decrease. Conversely, as demand for a service increases, that service will tend to cost more, and there will be eventually an increase in supply that will go with it because economic actors are incentivized and companies are incentivized to provide that good or service as the demand increases. So look, for example, at the price of PPE gear, personal protective equipment in the context of COVID-19. The price of COVID-related equipment has increased over time since COVID began compared to before. I'll look now at fertilizer prices because of COVID. Because there's a scarcity of fertilizer, because Russia invaded Ukraine, you notice that fertilizer, mostly produced out of Canada, for example, is more profitable and more expensive because the demand for fertilizer is increasing given sanctions imposed upon Ukraine and Russia, which are large exporters of fertilizer and agricultural products in general. So equilibrium reasoning allows you to find that point at which supply equals demand and exchange occurs. Because if a price is set too high, then no one's going to buy something. And if a price is set too low, then no one's going to supply that thing because they're not going to be able to profit. So you need to find exactly that equilibrium point at which is going to be a stable market for that good or service. For example, go to your local grocery store. Notice that prices tend to stay relatively constant with low variance over the course of a month or so. Of course, now, because we're in 2022, we're in a global supply chain crisis induced because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, plus COVID, plus other supply chain issues, you're going to see fluctuations in price. But the basic thought is that in any given day, the price is going to remain mostly constant, for example. And that's a form of equilibrium reasoning. It reaches an equilibrium point and hardly deviates from that, given you hold fixed the supply and demand for that good or service. There was also a debate amongst Fisher, Jevons, Volvers, and Edgeworth as to the relevance of psychology. So consider someone such as Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher is trained at Yale University. He's actually offered the very first economics PhD by Yale University in 1891. And he's taught actually by a physicist named Josiah Willard Gibbs. So the physics influence is very clear here. And secondly, he's taught by a proto-eugenicist by the name of William Sumner. And I mention this because Fisher was not taught by a psychologist. In fact, he had views about human nature and economic transactions such that economics has to be understood as a separate discipline from that of psychology. So you might think, well, how does that make any sense? Clearly, I need to know how humans behave in order to provide a theory of consumer preferences and behavior, and in order to understand how it is that people have a demand or a lack of demand for goods and services. Fisher actually thought that that's the job of the psychologist. So that raises the question, well, what then is the job of the economist? The job of the economist is to provide a mathematically precise model of how it is that given these input human psychological preferences and behaviors, what is the just or equilibrium price that would be set, or what is the dynamics of supply and demand given these inputs from psychology? So Fisher was an anti-psychologist insofar as he thought that psychology is to be understood as a very separate discipline from that of economics. This is a bit different than someone like Francis Ysidro Edgeworth, very prominent and important economist and statistician in England. So Edgeworth was particularly active at the University of Oxford, a world-famous university, and Edgeworth advocated so-called social well-being measures by way of a theory of value in 1877. So again, we're staying in that decade between 1870 to 1880 or so. And Edgeworth had mathematically precise theories of social well-being, that is how well-off society is, largely understood, broadly understood, And he did so using so-called calculus of variations. We can't go into all this mathematics, unfortunately, but the basic thought here is that you look at the maxima and minima calculations that are used in calculus of variations for the least action principle in classical mechanics. So if you've studied a bit of physics, you know what I'm talking about. And he took inspiration from the methods of physics to find maxima and minima for utility functions, etc., so that he could calculate a mathematically precise model of an efficient use of goods or services given people's utilities functions in the way that I described marginal utility earlier. Edgeworth also advocated a hedonometer, which is a third-party intersubjectively verifiable method to discern one's utility function. So suppose you're like me, I don't really care about cars. I have no, if I were to have someone gift me a Maserati, I couldn't care less. I would sell it immediately. In other words, the utility accrued to me from obtaining a Maserati is essentially zero. Whereas for me, I love popcorn, I like bubble tea, I like musical instruments. Those are things that generate a lot of hedonic positive affect in me. So they increase my utility as a human being. They allow me to do things. They allow me to make me happy. They satisfy my preferences. So the basic idea of a hedonometer is that we would find some way, and this, of course, predates more sophisticated neuroscience, so Edgeworth didn't exactly have in mind neuroscience, but some way of measuring physiologically the extent at which my marginal utility is changing when I consume a good or service and how my preferences are changing with respect to my hedonic affect. And this would be super useful because it combines psychology with economic theory. Suppose that Amazon could know exactly what made people happy and what didn't make them happy using a hedonometer. So you go up to a person and you have some measuring instrument that could somehow analyze the brain or something like that, and you could find out what people's preferences are. Edgeworth mused upon this. When I say muse, he didn't have a worked out theory. He just had a few remarks. He had a few ideas of this. So Edgeworth was quite influential in the history of neoclassical thinking as to debates about the feasibility of such methods. Okay, so even today in behavioral economics and in social psychology, there's lots of debates as to what extent it's possible to measure happiness. So you can watch another lecture of mine that I will record and post on this YouTube channel on measures of well-being in another YouTube video. Lastly, Leon Walras, Swiss-French economist, introduces the idea of general equilibrium. So as I mentioned before, equilibrium reasoning is pervasive in economic thought, and its inspiration from physics and astronomy is particularly explicitly made clear in their writings. Moving on to other social sciences, we're going to talk a bit about anthropology and sociology in a little bit more detail than we did before with Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and Auguste Comte. Now we're going to talk about 19th century figures such as Herbert Spencer, Francis Galton, Karl Pearson, and Franz Boas. Okay, so Herbert Spencer, most famous for advocating social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is a very controversial theory, which states that capitalism is a very good system because it allows the weakest to be phased out and die, namely poor people, and allows rich people to thrive. And the basic thought here is that capitalism is a very efficient market system that rewards people who make good investment choices and who have profitable ideas and who are hard workers compared to those who do not. Spencer had a much more sophisticated theory of this, but this is the basic thought about this. And he thought that the weak should only marry and procreate with that of the weak, and the strong should only marry and procreate with that of the strong. So this is why it's social Darwinism. Again, Darwin himself did not in any way advocate this. I want to make this very clear. This is a term that Herbert Spencer himself advocated as a result of reading Darwinian theories and coming to conclusions that are distinct from that of Darwin, of what Darwin himself came to conclusions of his own theories. So that's very important to mention. So even though it's called social Darwinism, it really doesn't have much to do with Darwinism at all. Secondly, Herbert Spencer advocated the survival of the fittest concept. So you've probably heard of this concept and you think, oh, isn't that what Darwin said? No, this is not what Darwin said. This is a Herbert Spencer idea. So Herbert Spencer was a very elitist person. He thought that, oh, if you're poor and homeless, well, you actually deserve to be poor and homeless. If you're super wealthy and aristocrat and you own tons of land, you actually deserve to do it. In fact, you are the most fit person to do so, because something in your evolutionary or socioeconomic history or your cultural lineage allowed you to accrue power, and it was just for the most part. Now, this is a highly elitist perspective. Again, I'm not advocating this. I'm just trying to teach you what Spencer believed. And Spencer was an advocate also, an influence on other eugenicists, such as Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. So again, what is eugenics? To refresh your memory, there's positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is advocating that select people who have desirable traits procreate to create more desirable people. Negative eugenics is the opposite. It's saying that we need to kill off or sterilize or prevent people from mating and procreating who are undesirable people, with undesirable physical characteristics or undesirable mental characteristics. So Francis Galton was a big advocate of this, and so was Karl Pearson in the United Kingdom at this time. Francis Galton is also very important for developing intelligence metrics. So you have these metrics of IQ, for example, intelligence quotient, etc. And so the kind of beginnings of the statistical inference methods and empirical methods for measuring intelligence arise in the context of the mid-19th century in Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson is very important for introducing the statistic known as correlation. Everyone is familiar with the idea of correlation, but the mathematical definition of correlation, which you can look up on your own time, is actually due to Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson was very influential in the natural and social sciences. Karl Pearson actually had a theory of gravity, amongst other things, but we won't get into that. Karl Pearson was very influential in eugenics, criminology, in biomedical statistics, and generally every aspect of the history of statistical thinking in general. So he's an applied mathematician, very gifted, very mathematically gifted man. Franz Boas is the first anthropologist that we're going to discuss in this lecture. So Franz Boas is really important because he gave rise to the method known as ethnography. Of course, there were people before Franz Boas, whether it be Marco Polo, whether it be Blumenbach, Hans Blumenbach, whether it be Aristotle, whether it be the ancients, who also roamed to other cultures, interviewed people, asked questions, got to know people, learned the culture, customs, habits, etc. But it was Franz Boas who was kind of a seminal figure in making this process a little bit more rigorous and influential in academic circles. And also, he was an advocate of cultural relativism. So there was a lot of bigotry, a lot of racism, there was a lot of views at this time, even today, but especially at this time and before, that there were kind of superior or inferior cultures. And Boas says, well, wait a second, actually, cultural relativism is a really interesting idea because when I go and live with Madagascari native people, I see that actually Madagascari native people have much different way of living than I do. And who am I to say that my culture is superior or worse to their culture? That's the basic idea of cultural relativism. It's not necessarily to say that all cultures are equal. It is, however, to say that the idea of lesser or better is itself relative only to your assumed set of cultural values that you've been raised into and your society has taught you. Okay? And so Franz Boas brought sensitivity of this anthropological feature to that of Western society and Western intellectuals. Franz Boas was also one of the first major opponents of scientific racism. You have some precedent in Hans Blumenbach, amongst other figures, but Franz Boas was very famous for advocating that scientific racism had no support whatsoever. So phrenology, for example, is very popular at this time. Phrenology is a theory that says that depending on the skull structure that you're born with, again, you had no choice about this, that determines the probability, if you were to open up your skull, look at its geometry, etc., that determines the probability, depending on certain parts of the skull, that you commit crimes, that you're a rapist, that you're a murderer, that you're a serial killer, etc., etc., etc. Franz Boas thought this was a discredited science, even for the time, though there was a number of very, very smart people who did think that phrenology had legitimacy. And Franz Boas was also an advocate of the view that ostensibly elitist racist views are actually just cultural biases. So when you have the history of the slave trade, etc., Boas thought there's no scientific support for saying that these people that were enslaving are genetically inferior or that they're essentially inferior in some kind of metaphysical sense of which there are distinct races, etc. Rather, there's a lot more similarities between cultures than there are differences, especially understood physically and psychologically. And so even though it's obvious that people have different cultures and have different beliefs, Boas didn't think that that was absolutely essential to them from birth. Rather, people are taught, people are indoctrinated, people are influenced to have various views that they do. And this is considered a relatively radical idea for 19th century thinking, especially amongst Western intellectuals. The other three anthropologists we're going to be looking at are Margaret Mead, an American, Gregory Bates, also an American, and Horace Minor, also an American. So you can see anthropology is very popular in the United States in the 20th century. Who is Margaret Mead? Well, basically Margaret Mead was a female anthropologist, relatively uncommon for the time, in a time in which females were not very much welcome in social science. Margaret Mead is known for an ethnography of the Samoan people and for decentering North American morals and mores. Mores are kind of like cultural practices, customs, and habits. And this is important because Margaret Mead is also influential in the history of the sexual revolution in the 1960s, etc. and sexual diversity awareness. So she was very influential in getting Western people to see that, hey, you're just basically being a prude. There are different kinds of sexual practices happening in the Samoans, amongst other kinds of cultures, that show you that these things are contingent. They're not necessary. It's not necessary to have a nuclear family where you have a husband, wife, kids, etc. It's not necessary that we have Christian, Islamic, or Jewish values about family planning, etc. We can actually have a structure of society that can be stable, that can be reasonable, that has a lot more sexual exploration, for example. And so she came to some of these conclusions through doing anthropological research on other cultures. She also brought awareness to gender hierarchy awareness. So whether this be the wage gap between men and women, whether this be about sexual harassment in the workplace, whether it be about the way men generally treat women in North American culture in the mid-20th century, etc. And lastly, Margaret Mead was quite critical of intelligence testing methods. So she thought that IQ tests, for example, were deeply flawed. If you read, for example, work on African-American psychiatrists who challenged typically white psychiatrists' IQ metrics, you will see that actually there were many convincing arguments that these IQ metrics were problematic. So an objection leveled by some African-American psychiatrists against these white psychiatrists is that the IQ test questions are asking questions that are culturally sensitive and relative to white culture at the time. And so if you're a person coming from a black culture, maybe you didn't know various particular things, whether it be songs, whether it be objects, whether it be places, dates, all sorts of ideas in general, because you weren't raised in that culture. And so if a IQ test is culturally relative, that arguably undermines any objectivity to the IQ test. Rather, it should just be called a cultural awareness test or something like this, as opposed to objective intelligence understood. And in fact, intelligence tests throughout their history have been used to oppress people. Even to this day, people can't get jobs in certain places because they didn't score high enough grades, or they had an IQ that's considered too low, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to look carefully at intelligence tests and to ask yourself which parts are valid and which parts are completely invalid and unjustified in terms of its scientific methodology. So Margaret Mead was very influential at this time in challenging and getting to think about intelligence testing in the mid-20th century. A contemporary of Margaret Mead was Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson is well known for work in cybernetics, anthropology, psychology, and so-called double-bind theory. Cybernetics is a somewhat obsolete theory now in contemporary social sciences, but cybernetics basically combines all of the major social sciences into one holistically understood discipline. That also includes systems theory. And so in this field known as cybernetics, there's the idea that you combine business management theory, psychology, anthropology, sociology, a little bit of philosophy to provide a holistic account of human nature. Nowadays, this is no longer advocated as a field of inquiry, mostly because it's too ambitious. It's too ambitious to try to provide such a rich, holistic theory of human nature because it's hard enough to understand the sociological factors, it's hard enough to understand individually the psychological factors, and it's hard enough to understand the anthropological features that go into studying human beings. So humans are just way more complex than we used to think they were. What is this double-bind theory? Well, this double-bind theory is an account primarily of schizophrenia in its original manifestations and research program, but then it started to change later on and become applicable to other aspects of human dynamics and inner relations. So double-bind theory is a case where suppose you have a situation where you have a schizophrenic mother, and then you have someone who is a child of that schizophrenic mother who is otherwise normal. And in this context, there's going to be this kind of love-hate relationship that the schizophrenic mother typically has with their child because they're not reasoning in a clear enough manner, they're mentally ill, they have various problems. And it's double-bind because the child is going to be raised very confused because at various times the mother will want to be sympathetic, empathetic, expressing love physically by giving hugs, etc., and there's going to be times where they're pushing away. And so double-bind theory is really important because it helps to understand that double-bind aspects appear throughout numerous human relationships at different points in their time and to different degrees. Now, it's again, I said it's the original circumstances in which Bateson developed the theory was in schizophrenia studies, but you can extrapolate this basic idea into other aspects of human relations, where there's this kind of dynamic, this push and shove, this give and take between human interactions. Lastly, Bateson was very influential in standpoint bias theory. So what does that say? That basically says, let's use one example. Maybe I, as a male heterosexual 29-year-old Chinese Canadian national, I can't know what it's like for the African American woman to suffer as a result of racism in a country, in a U.S. state such as Arkansas or Alabama, because I don't have the standpoint that they do. I was born in a very specific time period. I've never experienced racism systematically to the extent many Black people have. It's because of my standpoint of the kind of ethnic and cultural categories that define me as a person that make it very difficult for me to understand the suffering or the state of being of other people. Standpoint bias theory doesn't need to be always negative. It can also be positive aspects. For example, if you want to understand trans people, you better go talk to trans people. You can't just expect you to understand trans people without being able to understand them. So if you want to produce a more rigorous science of trans people, you need to go talk to them. And this is very important because at the time, there were a lot of prejudices social scientists had. They would try to go in, study people, but they brought in their cultural baggage. They brought in their standpoint. And this rendered null any kind of purported objectivity they claimed to have over their research subjects. And so by introducing cultural relativism from Franz Boas, if you remember the previous slide, aspects of gender hierarchy awareness, sexual diversity awareness, and standpoint bias theory in the work of Mead and Bateson, that allows you to avoid various social scientific biases that you might have when you try to understand the behavior of someone. This is obviously very difficult, very challenging. It's not perfect. There's many challenges that it faces, but at least having awareness of that standpoint bias can allow you to have a richer conception of human nature and of the human subjects that you're trying to study. And the last anthropologist I'll mention is Horace Minor. Horace Minor is actually not that famous. I mention him because he wrote a really funny paper called Body Ritual Among the Nasarima. I will leave it up to you to figure out who the Nasarima are. If you get the chance, do Google this paper. It's only 5 pages long. It's not technical. And you can read it, and you'll find it quite interesting because it is an analysis of the Nasarima people. And I don't want to give it away. Do read it and tell me what you think in the comments below, or maybe send me an email. And I'm mentioning this because it allows you to understand that anthropology is a very powerful social science. It's a very powerful social science because it allows you to analyze yourself and other people and to think about culture in a lot more rigorously in terms of the biases and problems that your culture may face. And it helps to sober you up and prevent bigotry and elitism about your culture necessarily being superior to another culture. And Horace Minor's paper, again, I won't give it away, has a really kind of nice and entertaining way to kind of illustrate this point. All right, that concludes our whirlwind tour of the history of the social sciences in the Western world. We covered about 2,500 years of history. I did my best to give you as concise a summary as I could while describing the key ideas. Now we're going to discuss methods and philosophy. So we've done the history section, we're on to methods and the philosophy side of today's discussion. So first, we need to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative methods. So let's focus first on quantitative methods. Quantitative methods are called quantitative because they involve mathematics and they involve the calculation of quantities, numbers. In order to do this, we have to look at a few different methods. First, we're going to look at survey methods. So survey methods you guys are all familiar with. If you guys have ever taken a U.S. Census Bureau survey or a Statistics Canada census before, you're familiar with the idea of being surveyed. If you've ever, received spam email, you probably know what a survey is. They ask you some questions. They're trying to figure you out. What do you believe? What do you prefer? What are your preferences? What do you think? And surveys can be divided roughly into random versus non-randomized surveys, by which I mean a randomized survey is a survey that is administered randomly, that is by chance, and uniformly distributed with respect to its probability for each member of the population to receive. So again, we can't suppose you're Starbucks and you want to do a consumer survey about whether people like their new Frappuccino. You can't send a survey to every single Canadian citizen. If Starbucks wants to find out whether people like their new Frappuccino, you have to rather choose a tiny group of those people, maybe a couple thousand people, send surveys to them, and make it so that the choice of those couple thousand people are randomly selected. This is important because it avoids bias. And it's very important to avoid bias because you don't want to just survey only, let's suppose, Chinese nationals, because then that won't be representative of all Canadians. If you really want to understand what Canadians think of the new Frappuccino from Starbucks, you got to survey them randomly so that there's no bias in the actual sample size that you're generating. A non-randomized sample sounds exactly what it sounds like. It's if I were to only survey Chinese people, for instance. Okay, so what are the distinctions between descriptive statistics and inferential statistics? Well, descriptive statistics are mathematical statistics that describe the data set that you already collected, okay? So when I go out and do a survey, I'm going to have a histogram describing the frequency of various observable traits that concern my study. So suppose I'm interested again in looking at consumer preferences for a wide variety of Starbucks products, Frappuccino, Mocha, pumpkin spice latte, you name it, Americano. Then I need to calculate the mean, the mode, the variance, standard deviation, nominal category counts, etc. So I'm going to want to know what the average person thinks, what is the most liked Starbucks product, which is the mode, what is the variance of that distribution. So suppose we took the survey at 2 different times. How much did the frequency of Frappuccino lovers, how did that change with respect to time, for instance, standard deviation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That is descriptive statistics. So descriptive statistics begins with a data set, and you describe that data set. You make no claims about the future of that data set. You make no claims about the past of that data set. You make no claims about the general population understood as a whole. You just look at what the sample says. Inferential statistics is the more commonly known subfield of statistical inference. And inferential statistics is what it sounds like. You have to infer on the basis of a finite small data set what the general population thinks about Starbucks Frappuccinos, for example. And in doing so, you have to apply a lot of sophisticated mathematical techniques using random sampling, t-tests, chi-square tests, etc. We can talk a little bit about one example in just a moment. But suppose that you wanted to predict the outcome of the 2020 American election. You have Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. And you want to make a prediction as to what people will vote for. Statisticians and political scientists do this all the time. What they do is they, organizations such as Politico or professors at institutions such as Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, Chicago, they administer randomly administered surveys to small samples of U.S. adults, and they ask them to provide their voting preferences, and then on the basis of that small sample, they infer what the general population of all 300 plus million Americans think is going to win the election. And so inferential statistics starts with a pre-given data set, so you have to do descriptive statistics before you do inferential statistics, and then allows you to generalize from that finite small data set to a much larger population level data set for the rest of the group that interests you. So this contrasts with qualitative methods because, as we saw in the context of sociology and anthropology, qualitative methods are very important. You got to do interviews with people. You got to do ethnography. You got to live with the culture, study them, see their cultural customs and habits, learn their language, see their behavior. And that's a non-mathematical method to try to understand human behavior and social phenomena. So good social science will actually combine both of these features. Good social science will combine the quantitative aspects, statistical methods, and mathematical techniques, and it will combine good qualitative research discerning biases, tendencies, mental dispositions, cultural habits, and customs of a group that concerns you. So let's just use the example for voting election in 2020 in the United States as one example all over again. So we want to decide who's going to win the election, what's the probabilities? Well, you provide a random survey sampling from U.S. adults of voting age. You might also want to conduct an ethnography because you want to interview, for example, Asian Americans and see what they think and understand to what extent Biden's administration or Trump's administration have any promises to make about Asian American well-being, whether it be immigration, whether it be about income, whether it be about racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would need a sociologist to provide ethnographic techniques to come and interview people, understand that culture, write up a research report saying, okay, Asian Americans live and breathe and think this way. And then look also at the quantitative data, inferring the probabilities as to whether or not Asian Americans understood as a whole, because you can't interview every Asian American, you can only interview maybe a couple hundred of them, what every Asian American thinks about Biden versus Trump and their electoral preferences for voting. So that's an example of how you'll have to combine quantitative with qualitative methods when you do good social science. Having described a brief overview of the kind of general methods that are used in social science, we have to talk a little bit more about the philosophy of social science. So what do I mean by the philosophy of social science? You might think to yourself, what is philosophy? Like, I don't understand what that means. Do you just sit around, smoke weed, talk about stuff? Do we just sit there like with our chins like this, thinking about stuff? No. What I mean is the systematic critical analysis of the assumptions and methods used in the social sciences. So when I say philosophy of science, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of economics, philosophy of sociology, all that means is code word or synonym for methodology of this. And it's specifically an inquiry into the foundational assumptions of that field. Okay, so in describing the philosophy of social science, we're going to look at interdisciplinarity and the idea that social science methods are particularly powerful when they draw upon multiple different kinds of social sciences as well as the natural sciences. Not everyone agrees with this, but I'm going to describe various strengths and weaknesses of interdisciplinarity. In order to do so, I got to look at a paper by Sofia Efstathio and Zara Mirmalek. I don't know how to pronounce the name, so I forgive the authors if I'm mispronouncing them, which I most certainly am. But we're going to look at a paper of theirs, which I thought was pretty interesting, and it helps you to understand a bit more about how interdisciplinary research works in social science in practice. So to begin with, we look at the Latinate root semantics of the word discipline. So it comes from the Latin word discere, which is to learn. And the idea of discipline is that you are learning and studying a phenomena in great detail. Now, you might think that you can study things without looking at other disciplines. You might think that, hey, I'm a sociologist. I only look at class structure. I only look at, for example, how maybe the media is structured in a certain way through radio in Jamaica, or I look at how media is state censored by Turkmenistan and North Korean dictators, for example. Why do I need to look at what the economic situation is? Why do I need to look at what neuroscientists have to say about human preferences and the motor cortex and all the other aspects of our human brain? Well, the reason is because if you really want to truly learn about something, if you really want to truly understand something, you better look at multiple different ways to understand that thing. Okay? And it's not to say that all different ways to understand a thing are equally valid. That is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's important to be exposed to and be open-minded about different fields, having things to say about the phenomena that you're studying that may actually conflict with what you're studying. So it's very important to have this check and balance system where you can, suppose, again, using the example of sociology, maybe the sociologist didn't think to factor into account psychological factors. Maybe they didn't think to factor into account economic factors. Maybe the power structures of the fact that Turkmenistan exports natural gas and oil is what causes it to be an authoritarian country, or maybe it's because North Korea has a philosophy of communism, in big scare quotes, that allows it to be an authoritarian state apparatus structure that oppresses people. You know, the sociologist would have to look at the economic relations, the political scientific theories about states, etc., in order to provide a holistic account of how it is that humans operate in society. So the three main goals of interdisciplinarity are arguably, one, finding common basis for what's at stake in the inquiry. So let's use an example of, let's suppose, poverty analysis, okay? So if you're interested in poverty, clearly, who are the stakeholders in analysis of poverty? Obviously, the poor people. Secondly, the government, because the government needs to use government expenditure to fund social welfare programs. And thirdly, the general public, because the general public wants to avoid being poor. Everyone wants to avoid being poor. So the common goal of all interdisciplinary research and all social science research in general is to find a common basis for what's at stake in studying poverty. Why do we care? Right? So that leads me to the second and third things, which is deciding how to solve problems, and third, justifying why we should pursue matters of inquiry. Why do we care to study this thing at all? So to walk you through a concrete case study in interdisciplinary social science, we're going to look at racial health disparities in the United States. So according to one study in 2010, blacks are 40% more likely than non-Hispanic whites to be diagnosed with diabetes. That's significant. That's a highly non-trivial statistic if you think about it. It suggests that there's something going on here. Whether it be cultural, whether it be genetic, whether it be political. Something is happening such that African Americans are disproportionately affected with diabetes compared to non-Hispanic whites. That raises many questions. Is it the economic structure? Is there something about the psychology of black people? Is there something about the culture of black people? Is there something about the dietary consumption habits? Is there something about the medical costs that black people face? It's probably many of these factors. And it requires detailed social scientific analysis and interdisciplinary research from medical epidemiologists to neuroscientists to psychologists to economists to sociologists to provide a general model and theory of why it is that it's happening. Notice also that 71% of minorities, 71% with HIV or AIDS are from minority groups. So again, this suggests that something is happening. Something very problematic is happening. Something very tragic is happening, where minority groups are disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS. And in order for us to understand this, we need to draw upon the natural sciences of biology, medicine, plus the social sciences of economics, sociology, and anthropology to figure out what it is that's causing people to have this. Is it because people are sharing needles? Is it because there's less education amongst minorities compared to non-Hispanic whites? Is it because that people are maybe more active in certain areas in which HIV and AIDS are more prevalent. It's very unclear. So we need to construct a model. So to discuss a bit about the philosophy of this, it's very important that we combine diverse and conflicting methodological perspectives. It's important because it's actually very unclear in cases in which there is conflict between methodological perspectives what we should do. So for example, suppose that a sociologist thinks that actually the reason for the disproportionate impact of HIV and AIDS on minority groups is because of racism. And then an economist says that actually it has very little to do with race. It has entirely to do with socioeconomic class. Maybe it's because the jobs are what's more important as a variable in the model, and the extent to which people have higher incomes or lower incomes and therefore have higher or lower access to health insurance that's causing this. So how do you dissolve these disputes? There's going to be disputes all the time. You have this where anthropologists are disagreeing about whether this ethnographic method was rigorous or not, whether or not the gender hierarchy that they're observing in Madagascari native people is actually evidence of a gender hierarchy as opposed to maybe misinterpreting the ethnographic study. How do you come to any agreement about this? There's no clear methods, okay? There's just going to be raging debates. There's going to be debates about values. There's going to be debates about standpoint bias. There's going to be debates about funding. Maybe they didn't have enough money to fund the research well, and that's why the study sucked. That happens a lot of the cases. Money has to come from somewhere. Studies have to come from money. Therefore, studies are subjected to funding biases in many cases. Notice also that in the context of measurement or metrological issues, to use a more technical term, race and ethnicity as social scientific concepts are constantly changing. Okay, so Chinese people inhabiting the geographical boundaries of China today are very different than they were 4,000 years ago. The notion of what it means to be black in the United States obviously is changing over time. Are Jamaicans black? Are people from genetically from Ghana within the past 200 years, are they black? Are they equally black? These are open questions. Are people who have an ancestor who is white but mostly black lineage otherwise, are they black? These concepts are constantly changing. Am I Chinese? I've never even been to China. I just have parents whose parents themselves were born in China. So it's important to notice philosophical problems in social scientific methodology where the measurement constructs for social categories continue to change as well. So this contingency of the categories changes is also very important to be sensitive to, and debates often happen at that level. Notice also that biological markers for race and ethnicity, etc., are considered relatively stable by way of contrast. I'm going to have a whole other video on the philosophy and science and sociology of race, so we won't get too much into this, but the point is that if you're going to look at biological markers for categories such as race, because notice, in fact, the statistics before, we're using certain concepts of race, such as blacks, such as non-Hispanic whites, such as Asians, such as minorities, that there's going to be lots of debates between anthropologists and biologists as to what is considered an adequate and scientifically respectable concept of race. Okay, so any allegedly stable biological markers may actually not be so stable upon analysis. So you have to be very careful when you read statistics about minorities, blacks, non-Hispanic whites, Egyptians, Americans, etc. Are these categories actually just socially constructed? If they're socially constructed, how are they socially constructed? What are the strengths and weaknesses of defining and categorizing people into these particular categories? So to illustrate this last point that I was mentioning on race, just look at the Office of Management and Budget the definition of race, for example. So the US OMB is the bureau that's responsible for the census and for administering statistics on demography amongst the US government. So there are 5 races according to the United States government: American Indian, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and lastly, white. Now notice that there isn't a clear category, for example, for Middle Eastern people. So there seems to be some problems with this. So it seems that an Iranian is actually considered either Asian, but then an Egyptian is considered white. And then a Greek person is considered white, even if they have very dark skin, or an Italian and South Italy people have dark skins, but they're considered white as well. And then notice that Asians are just grouped together. So I'm just as Asian as is an Indian, and a Japanese person is just as Asian as is a Korean. You might think that there can be problems here because clearly culturally they're different. We look different. It's not clear that genetically we actually share a lot of origins together. In fact, as you're going to see in other videos, genetic origins and the distribution of genotypes with respect to phenotypes is actually a lot more varied than you might think. And secondly, varied in certain ways, but also secondly, they're much more similar than you might think. So I actually have a lot of genetic similarity to white people, and I have much more similar to white people than I do to even my fellow allegedly Chinese person. So according to a philosopher of biology, Quaishon Spencer, using cladistics data, these race divisions into American Indian, Asian, Black, Native American, Native Hawaiian, and white are actually justified in light of biological data. We'll get into that debate in a moment later on, as well as into another video on race that I will publish on this YouTube channel later on. But in general, this illustrates the point of interdisciplinarity, because you're going to need biologists, you're going to need geneticists, you're going to need anthropologists, you're going to need sociologists to discuss and debate theories of whether the categorization of race in the US Census Bureau is adequate or inadequate. A point at which interdisciplinary research becomes very contentious is the rigor of methods. So in this case, we're going to talk about randomized control trials. Randomized control trials are considered the gold standard of evidence. That is the highest standard of evidence. After all, you can have different qualities of evidence in the fields of agriculture, medicine, psychology, and economics primarily. So what is a randomized control trial? A randomized control trial consists of a sample from the general population that is divided up into two groups. The first group will be subjected to the intervention that you want to test, and the second group will not be subjected to the intervention that you want to test. So you have an experimental group and a control group. And the idea is that once you measure, after you've given the intervention, sometime later you measure the effect of that intervention, you can see to what extent the intervention had a particular effect versus some background confounding variable. So suppose you didn't have, for example, a randomized control trial. There was neither randomization nor was there a control group. Then how can you say that it was due to the intervention that caused the effect that you observed as opposed to some other confounding background variable? So suppose that you wanted to test an antidepressant and you're running a medical trial. One way to do it is you give the antidepressant to a group of people and you do not give the antidepressant to the control group. And suppose that at the end of it, you notice that people who took the antidepressant had much lower depression score readings as defined by the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, the DSM, which is used by the American Psychiatric Association. Then you'll conclude that actually it was the antidepressant that was responsible for lowering depression. Because, after all, the control and experimental group, before you gave one group the treatment and the other group the control group, which is the placebo effect, then there's no difference. The only difference is going to be that of the intervention that you gave to the experimental group. And so you can confidently say that the probability is very high that it was due to the intervention given to the experimental group that was responsible for it, as opposed to background factors such as the wages, the gender, the socioeconomic background. You control for those factors when you do the initial random sampling. And this raises questions as to how much can history/induction be relied upon. So for those who are not familiar, induction is this idea that something behaved in a certain way in the past, therefore it'll behave similarly in the future. Famously, the philosopher David Hume criticized this method of inquiry, which we won't get into right now. And I mention this because you look at social systems and you think, actually, they're highly anti-inductive. It seems to be the case that actually you can study people for a long period of time, but all of a sudden, in a couple of years later, they act very differently. So what's an example? Maybe you could look at, let's suppose, people's preferences for certain video games. So back when I grew up, people were really into Pokemon. Pokemon is no longer as popular as it used to be. So if you did some social science studies because you tried to understand people's consumer preferences for purchasing Pokemon video games, or you want to understand the sociology of Pokemon, why is it culturally that people love Pokemon? Is it something about them being cute little creatures or something like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What is it about it to be the case? All that data you collected in the 1990s on Pokemon, when Pokemon first started becoming popular, may become completely irrelevant in the 2010s, when Pokemon consumption was not as prevalent. So that shows you that when you do a social scientific study, you have to look at history. You have to look at the extent to which people's cultural preferences change over time. So it's very difficult to extrapolate and produce an externally valid model of human behavior when you have an initial time slice of which you analyze a group of people with respect to certain social phenomena, and you extrapolate at a later time slice in a different cultural context how they might behave if they were exposed to Pokemon. So all these studies about Pokemon in the 90s might no longer apply to people's behavior if they were exposed to Pokemon in 2022. There's also this debate as to what extent randomized control trials are actually necessary, and in fact, in some cases, they can even be harmful. So there's cases of the so-called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation study, ECMO study that was done. It was already known that the study, prior to the study, that administering a certain drug would be harmful. And yet there wasn't a randomized control trial that was conducted to test this drug. And so according to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and according to various US medical health scientists, they thought, well, we need to make sure that we can test this intervention related to ECMO and in order to satisfy the highest gold standard of evidence in medicine. And again, there already seemed to be strong inductive evidence from previous exposure and engagement with ECMO that a particular intervention wasn't effective, and yet they ran the study anyways, and it led actually to the death of many infants. So that shows you that randomized control trials aren't always necessary, nor are they always good things. There's also certain cases in which you can't even run a randomized control trial. One example is psychedelic therapy. So recently there's been attempts to administer psilocybin mushrooms, more colloquially known as magic mushrooms, as well as LSD drugs as a means to alleviate depression and trauma symptoms. The problem is you can't run a randomized controlled trial on that. That is, you can't run the control part of that because you're going to know who's tripping balls and who's not tripping balls. It's very obvious. So all the bias, the double blind where the subject and the researcher doesn't know which drug has been administered to the control group and the experimental group is completely confounded, right? When someone takes LSD, as anyone knows who has taken LSD themselves or have seen someone on LSD, you're going to know that they're tripping compared to the other person. And so that introduces bias into the study, which makes it impossible to run a rigorous randomized control trial. This doesn't mean that the study has no basis. And this doesn't mean that psychedelic therapy can't be done. In fact, psychedelic therapy should probably be done because it's a novel and potentially promising method of therapy. It just means that it's very difficult to satisfy the so-called gold standard of randomized control trials in medicine and in psychiatry. And so there's going to be a raging philosophical debate as to the evidential rigor of randomized control trials vis-a-vis other kinds of methods. There are cohort studies, there are case studies, there are non-randomized trials. For example, there are non-controlled trials that are nonetheless randomized. There's all different kinds of variations on experimental design that are very important to the construction of a social scientific or medical study. So you can avoid needless deaths or conflicts of risk in experimentation or conflicts of interest if you have interdisciplinary scholars come together on a study to advise each other given their background expertise. And that produces a much more holistic and rigorous analysis. We now move on to a paper by Miriam Solomon, who's a professor of philosophy at Temple University in the United States. This paper is entitled Social Epistemology in Practice, and I'll discuss a bit what we mean by social epistemology in just a moment. So epistemology is a Greek word meaning of or pertaining to a theory of knowledge. And so if you think about it, when you come to know something, when you come to formulate a judgment about COVID's existence, inflation rate, whether or not milk is still going to be on the shelves the next day at the grocery store, anything at all, okay? Whether there's a cup in front of me, whether or not redshift is a phenomenon happening, an astrological phenomenon, you need to go through the following process. First is direct sense perception. Okay, so to know that there is a water bottle in front of me, I have to use the evidence of my eyeballs, right? So I have electromagnetic radiation bouncing off of this bottle, entering into my eyes, going to the back of my occipital lobe in my brain, processing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have to have direct sense perception is one form of knowledge about basic matters of fact. There is a bottle in front of me. I sense it with my eyes. Pretty straightforward, not complicated. Things get a little bit more complicated when memory is introduced. So for example, suppose that I remembered that there is a park nearby that is being constructed. It's currently under construction. That's a little less faulty than using direct sense perception. If I were to get up off of my chair, go over my window, look out using my eyes, maybe with some binoculars, and look off into the distance and see that the park is still being under construction, that would be using my direct sense perception. But I can't do that because I'm sitting here on this chair at this desk and I'm not over by my window over there. So I have to rely on my memory. A third level is having trust in others. So trust in others is very important in the practice of both natural and social sciences. So if you wanted to produce a study in a medical journal, or if you want to do medical research in general, you need to rely on the trust of other people engaged in peer review. And peer review is very important because it allows you to have a rigorous vetting process because individuals can be liable to be making mistakes all the time. So if you have a check and balance from another expert, then you can know whether you're making mistakes in your research design. And that leads to having trust that others trust others. So this is getting very meta, but this is very important. Because in order for you to, for example, do a study at the Large Hadron Collider, which is a particle accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland, where physicists are studying subatomic particles, you need to have a lot of trust in the hundreds of other physicists who are calculating energy levels, who are calculating velocities, mass, charge, etc., about subatomic particles, And when they publish these aggregate research reports with dozens of authors on it, you have to trust that every one of these people has reliable direct sense perception. That is, they looked at their computer screens correctly when the data is being processed and when the particles are being accelerated. You have to trust that their memory is working, and you have to trust that they trust you as well. Okay, so I'm just illustrating each of these points in the epistemic supply chain because I'm showing you how complicated science really is. And social science is even more complicated. Look, for example, at the construction of the rate of inflation occurring in North America. Look, for example, at the Canadian government's CPI, Consumer Price Index calculations. You have to look at a so-called representative basket of goods and services, whether it be toiletries, whether it be food, wheat, whether it be the price of gas, the price of oil, etc. In order for an economist at the Bank of Canada or whether it be economists at the University of Toronto, the university of which I teach at and study at, in order for them to discern the extent at which inflation is increasing or decreasing, they need to produce a measurement construct of inflation. And in doing that, they need to first rely upon direct sense experience, right? Because you have to go out into the grocery store and actually look at prices and see whether they're increasing or decreasing. You need to trust that your memory of your observing with your eyeballs what the prices are is reliable, that the memory is reliable when you do the data analysis when you get home or to your office. And third, you have to trust that other people who are collecting data for you, whether it be other graduate students, other researchers, that they have reliable sense perception and reliable memory. So I'm mentioning all this detail, which is kind of overwhelming probably to you, because it's important to see social epistemology in practice. That is, you get to see that social science is very complex and relies upon multiple groups of individual people developing a theory of knowledge together. And any parts of these theories of knowledge can either stand or fall depending on people's reliability to formulate judgments, to have reliable sense perception, and have reliable memories. And the last component of the process is technological trust. I have to trust that my computer right in front of me, that my smartphone of which I'm taking these videos on, is itself reliable, that its electricity is running correctly, that the code is running correctly, in order for me to rely upon the data sets that I use when doing statistical analysis afterwards, once I've collected data. And so if I can't even trust the technology that I'm using, then there's no way I'm going to be able to trust all the other humans that collected this data that put as inputs into an Excel spreadsheet to calculate statistics on poverty, on inflation, on race, on medical genetics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So technological trust is a key component of the human-computer, human-technological interaction that social scientists have to undergo in order to conduct social science studies. Furthermore, you have three different kinds of trust. You have so-called mathematical trust. You have trust in mathematicians providing and proving rigorous theorems in statistics and probability that allow you to make inferences validly. Secondly, there's going to be faith-based trusts. So there's going to be certain contexts in which maybe you come to believe in something purely on the basis of faith. You have no other clear evidence. You don't have clear sense perception. You just have to kind of like make a wild guess, so to speak. This is very uncommon and considered unacceptable in social science, but I do flag it because the common person engages in faith-based trust all the time, especially in religious matters. So I just want to flag it as a form of way of knowing, a form of epistemology. And lastly, of course, you have expertise trust. So look at myself, I'm trained to be a philosopher of social science, a methodologist of social science. So I need to establish and develop expertise through publishing in peer-reviewed journals. I need to become educated by professors. I need to be vetted in my dissertation by experts. I need to have peer review. And it's a very long process to become certified, to receive a PhD, to be considered an expert, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so expertise trust is really important because many people, when they're discussing matters of social scientific phenomena, they are not experts. You see YouTubers all the time who are not experts talking about scientific racism, people talking about IQ studies, people talking about immigration, people talking about interest rates, people talking about economic theory, people talking about cryptocurrencies. They are not typically experts. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't have PhDs. They don't have credentials in the private sector. They don't have strong resumes. They're just random people on the internet who have opinions. So it's very important to have a vetting procedure for discerning people who are experts and people who are not experts, because it leads to faulty and bad knowledge. Lastly, an important point to mention is that groups seem more trusting than individuals. The basic idea here is that if you have a bunch of people collectively converging on their agreement about something that they're observing, that's going to be more likely to be vetted through a peer review process implicitly than if a single individual told you about something. So, for example, I go outside and I think, oh my gosh, I saw aliens landing. I'm the only person who saw it. No one else saw it. That's not very trustworthy. But if you have 100 people outside who all claim the next day, oh my gosh, I saw the alien landing, that seems to be more evidence or higher probability of evidence that there would be an alien landing than if a single individual witnessed an alien landing. The same applies to social science. That's why we have entire departments at universities. That's why universities have tons of academics with PhDs who've studied these things for decades, very long time, develop expertise in a particular field of inquiry, because they form groups and entire faculties and departments so they can share and pool knowledge together to discuss ideas. So to use an example from Miriam Solomon's paper, we're going to look at expert consensus conferences. So these begin in the 1970s via the US National Institutes of Health, and they're a form of systematic evidence review, of which you look at a bunch of different medical studies and meta-analyses, and you have to come to a judgment about what all these different studies have to say about the general thing that you're studying, broadly construed. Then health experts meet for a few days to construct these guidelines to evaluate whether or not these studies are suggesting a certain thing or suggesting that something isn't happening. For example, whether or not the antidepressant was effective for mitigating depression. And in constructing those guidelines, you have multiple experts meeting together to provide a consensus. So they must have a way to evaluate the evidence from multiple studies and converge or diverge upon their agreement about whether or not the medical intervention is effective or not. Same thing happens in psychiatry. You have the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. It took until 1973 for homosexuality to be removed as a disease category, as a mental illness, amongst the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association. This is a case of consensus. This is a case where psychiatrists are getting together and saying, you know what, we no longer think that this is a mental illness. We think there are no longer scientifically well-formulated grounds to believe that homosexuality is necessarily a negative impact on a person's life. And this decision was made by psychiatrists in 1973. So this just shows you that you have to have a group of experts who come together who set the guidelines for what are disease categories and whether or not a study suggests a conclusion or does not suggest the conclusion from multiple different studies. After all, if you do a single study on something, that is some evidence for whatever claim the study's making, but it's not necessarily conclusive. In order for it to be conclusive, you need to do tons of studies by different types of people, different researchers at different times on different groups of people on the same phenomenon in order for you to have a wide variety of different opinions, for you to form a consensus about what the data suggests. So that's why you need to have these expert consensus conferences. And in conducting these natural science and social science consensus conferences, you're going to inevitably encounter the imposition of values. Okay, so what do I mean by values? Well, what I mean is something like this. So there's going to be what are called cognitive or theoretical values versus moral or ethical values. So in the natural sciences, we have a lot of these so-called cognitive values. So these cognitive values are going to be things like parsimony. So parsimony is that you shouldn't make any more assumptions than are necessary to explain something or predict something. We have things like internal consistency, which is whether the theory's claims are compatible with one another. We have explanatory power, the extent at which a theory is able to explain the phenomena. So famously, quantum mechanics is not explanatory, but it's highly predictively accurate, as an example from physics. Whether the theory is predictively accurate is another cognitive value that you want to have as a desideratum, and you desire this in scientific theories. And then you have ethical questions. In the social sciences, you have all the natural scientific values plus other values such as risk, appropriateness of socially constructive categories, and proxy measures. And this is really important because bias can be introduced. So consider theories of economics. Many theories of economics presume a capitalistic economic structure as a background assumption in their theory about how goods and services are organized. Perhaps neoclassical economic theory would be problematic or would not be able to make accurate predictions or make good explanations, or maybe it would even be predictively inaccurate if you were to analyze human economic relations in a non-capitalist society. So that shows you that economists are imputing values typically when they make economic judgments and they posit economic theories about inflation, interest rates, capital markets, etc., because they're imposing values about risk, appropriateness of socially constructed categories, and proxy measures. And I'll just use one example. So in the context of the United States, as anyone knows who's been following this, inflation's really bad. You know, the cost of meat's going up, the cost of bread's going up, the cost of oil and gas is going up. And in the construction of the Consumer Price Index used by the US Census Bureau, they have to weight different sectors of the economy in their calculation of the average rate of inflation. That is the average rate at which prices are increasing. And in the CPI, US Census Bureau actually values air transportation very highly. 18% approximately of the CPI calculations are weighted to air transportation. Now, if you think about it, this is kind of silly because if you think about it, people aren't traveling much by air given COVID. Of course, they're traveling more now than they did when COVID began, but they're not traveling anywhere close to the amount that they used to be traveling before COVID was happening in terms of air transportation. And yet, in a CPI inflation index rating, they're rating the cost of air transportation as very important to the typical basket of goods and services and its costs that Americans are going to encounter throughout their daily lives. 18%. That is way too high. It seems that a much more reasonable measure should be like 5%. Maybe 5% of the average person's expenditure is going to be on airfare. I don't know. If you're obviously a business person who's a salesperson who's going and selling software or selling all kinds of stuff, then yeah, you need to fly around a lot. But the typical American is not flying that often. They're driving, they're walking, they're cycling. So transportation costs should arguably look at fuel costs for cars more than they should be looking at things like airfare costs. So that's just an example of how values, where for whatever reason the U.S. Census Bureau values and privileges and has prejudices towards air transportation costs more than they have concern for calculating inflation rates on other things like groceries, fuel costs for your car, the cost of a bicycle, the cost of public transportation, etc. It's not to say they don't consider those calculations at all. It's just to say that that 18% should have less of that weight, maybe only 10%, maybe only 5%, and the weight should be distributed across other aspects of the sectors of the economy of which a typical American citizen will be affected by with respect to cost increases. Another thing to note is the influence of political ideology in the social sciences. So social sciences have occurred under authoritarian regimes all the time. The Nazis had social scientists engaged in psychology, of which many of their findings were very problematic because they were subjected to anti-Semitic bias. The Soviets had economic planners who were very prejudiced against capitalism, who were very prejudiced against certain forms of neoclassical and marginalist school of thinking. You have Italian fascists who are interested in demography, family planning, population statistics, etc. And so values are really important in showing how bias can enter into social scientific calculations. So notice that democracies are arguably really important for social science because they allow for the legally permissible negotiation of values in social science methodology. When I say negotiation, you might think, well, isn't everyone negotiating all the time? No. You take it for granted that you live, hopefully you live, in a non-authoritarian regime where you can actually debate values. You can actually debate what you care about, what you don't care about, what risks you're willing to take, what kind of studies you think are ethical. Do you think it would be ethical, as the Nazis thought it would be, to just starve a bunch of Jews and then calculate all kinds of various things about their psychology if they're under duress and stress from starvation? Arguably, it's extremely unethical. And that shows you how the political ideology of which social scientists are operating under heavily biases the research design, the ethics of that research design, and the extent at which the general public thinks that these are morally permissible things to be engaged in, etc. And so it's really important that you consider the influence that political ideologies tend to have. There might actually be certain studies that are maybe important to conduct, but for political reasons are impossible to conduct. So, just start to think about this. Ask yourself, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this, for example? Okay, putting aside the kind of core of the methodological considerations that social scientists need to consider, I want to now get into a bit more abstract territory and talk about some really philosophical questions that you may not have thought about before, nor have you been exposed to. The first is the idea of social constructionism. So what do I mean by social constructionism? Well, I mean that socially constructed entities or categorizations of people and places and things are due to human beings coming to regard things. So for example, me being regarded as a Chinese person is very different than me coming to regard the mass of this spoon as having the particular gram measurement that it does. When I say that this is however many grams, however many pounds, that is a lot less socially constructed. There is socially constructed features compared to the social construction of me being categorized as a Chinese person. Why? Because it's subjected to human bias and human regardation. That is, it's me regarding and other people having to come to regard me as a Chinese ethnic category, but being raised in Canada, that I come to have the quality of being a Chinese person. Notice that that's not the case for a spoon. For a spoon, we all accept, except for the Americans, the SI system of units. Well, American scientists do accept the SI system of units, but they typically use the imperial system of units, pounds, for example, feet and inches in terms of distance, miles. And we come to accept the usage of SI system of units, which is much more objective and less socially constructed when it comes to the measurement of mass and how much, for example, the spoon weighs. And so social constructionism is very important in the context of social science because every category is going to be socially constructed. Race depends on the biases of the researchers to come to categorize ethnic groups as distinct from racial groups. Things like what to include in the consumer price index is going to be socially constructed. So the mechanism by which social construction occurs is through collective intentionality. So I'm going to define this very precisely here as the existence of the object is only, and I'm going to italicize only, because people agree to regard it in a particular manner. So people cease coming to regard it in a particular manner, it no longer has the social function or social existence that it does. To use a really clear example, money. Okay? So consider, for example, a $5 bill. A $5 bill is literally just a piece of plastic. It has no intrinsic value. It has merely extrinsic value. The extrinsic value of it is that it's $5. It's worth $5 because it's considered fiat currency. Its value is decided by fiat by the government. And it's considered legal tender. That is, you must accept it if I owe a debt to you as a relieving of the debt. And if people come to stop regarding this as being a form of legal tender, then it's no longer considered a legitimate form of money. So that's what it means for there to be collective intentionality. You have a bunch of people who are intending for their minds to represent and model objects as having certain social functions. And this is actually a lot more profound than you might think it is, because this changes constantly and is subjected to political and ideological bias all the time, especially when it comes to the categorization of things like race, when it comes to ethnic categories, etc. I mean, what is a Chinese person? China is a very genetically diverse region of the world. What is a black person? There's so many different kinds. In fact, West Africa is one of the most diverse places on planet Earth, looking at the distribution of genotypes. How can you just homogenize black people into a single category? So this shows you that the social construction of social categories is highly contingent upon the researcher's interests and all the stakeholders' interests, and what moral and political biases and assumptions the researchers hold when they come to regard things in certain ways. Look also at things like artistic value. I mention artistic value because a Picasso is only worth $50 million because people consider this random Spanish artist named Pablo Picasso as having beautiful art. It is not intrinsic to nature. It is not like nature objectively says that Picasso is good art. No, it's human beings that agree or disagree that this is a good piece of art. Same goes for measures of inflation, like I talked about in the calculation of the consumer price index, and same goes for gender and sexuality. It is a social construct. That's not to say there are no biological elements whatsoever in deciding gender and sexuality. It is to say, however, that how you come to categorize and see a person as outwardly displaying features of masculinity or femininity or whatever it is that you care to focus on within the debate about gender and sexuality is socially constructed. It's coming to regard as highly culturally contingent, historically contingent, and politically and ideologically biased. So in having that, it shows you that social science is much more complicated than natural sciences. Because in the natural sciences, there are less and less of these kinds of biases that you tend to get, and social construction doesn't have quite as salient a feature as it does in the context of social sciences, such as economics and sociology in particular. Another philosophical issue that the social sciences face is the debate about propensities and the ontology of social systems. When I say ontology, I'm referring to the ancient Greek term of or pertaining to ways of being. So it's basically what kinds of entities, what kinds of things exist according to the social scientist. You might think, well, obviously tons of stuff exists. I mean, microphones exist. I got a microphone right here. This water bowl exists. I exist. Chinese people exist. Black people exist. Oppression exists. Racism exists. What are you talking about? Well, how it exists and the ways in which it exists is actually very complicated and sophisticated. So I'll try to use a few examples. Consider physical systems. Physical systems typically repeat again. Okay, so your computer is made out of plastic, which is itself made out of various petroleum products, which itself is made out of various chemical compounds and molecules. These molecules are in turn made of elements of the atomic periodic table of elements and are constructed of atoms. And these atoms are going to reappear again and again and again and again and again. So, for example, refrigerators typically have argon gas. They have nitrogen gas. The ambient air in my apartment has carbon dioxide, oxygen, obviously, nitrogen, argon, etc. Has different distributions. So these chemical elements will repeat again. They will exist and they will persist throughout the entirety of nature's existence. That's why we have conservation of energy, conservation of mass, etc., etc., etc. Notice that social systems don't have this. When you study a stock market crash, when a finance analyst or economist tries to study the stock market crash of 1987, or the stock market crash and general recession that happened in the United States and North America in 2007 to 2008 as a result of the subprime mortgage housing crisis, the way in which that crisis happened will not happen again, because all of these different features that leading up to the causes of this event are going to be very different, and they're not going to repeat again in exactly the same way. There might be certain features that do repeat, but all those features in general will not repeat. Whereas in the case of physical phenomena, they will repeat. They have a propensity to repeat. So for example, whether or not I do magnetism studies at the University of Toronto Physics Lab makes no difference if I did those magnetism studies in Kyoto, Japan, or if I did them in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, or if I did them in Gaborone, in Africa, or if I did them in Geneva, Switzerland. It makes no difference because the electromagnetic properties will repeat again. They're a stable physical structure. They have properties that are measurable again and again, and they have consistency in their ontology. Financial systems, political conflict systems aren't like this, right? So the Cuban Revolution leading up to the Fidel Castro administration in 1959, Mao's overtaking of Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, all these kinds of political conflicts, the structure that leads to the political conflict in the way political scientists study them will not repeat again. It's not possible to study the thing again in the same way it is in physical systems. So notice that social systems have different propensities to repeat or fail to repeat compared to that of physical systems. Physical systems have much more clearly discernible propensities and probabilities that govern the distribution of entities and relations between those entities in a physical system as opposed to a social system. And so this is why the economist Frank Knight, who was active at the University of Chicago in the early 20th century, made a distinction between uncertainty and risk. Uncertainty is where a scientist has fundamental unknowability about the phenomena. We have no justification for assigning any probabilities about the behavior of entities in that system than any other assignment of probabilities. Whereas the context of risk, if a system exhibits risk, then a system is exhibiting a probability distribution function where maybe you can't know deterministically. If you knew the initial conditions, you can determine all future conditions, but you can at least know the probability that a social system will behave in a certain kind of way. So to use an example, you might think that the price of milk, you can know the probabilities of the price of milk fluctuating over the course of time. So I just bought milk earlier today. I bought it for about like $5 for 2 liters. I can say with high probability that tomorrow the price will be roughly constant because there isn't a dairy crisis in Canada. However, if you were to ask me what the price is of gold 30 years from now, that's arguably uncertain knowledge as opposed to risk-based knowledge, because there's no basis for any probability estimates whatsoever. Maybe there's going to be a supply chain crisis of gold mining. Maybe there's going to be all-out total war. I have no idea of various confounding factors that could lead to fluctuations in the price of gold. So I'm just mentioning this because it's an important distinction between the natural and the physical sciences. How they deal with propensities, how they understand propensities, and how you model propensities is very important and very distinct. Another feature of social systems that's very different than natural scientific systems, such as physical systems, biological, or chemical systems, is this notion of reflexivity. So reflexivity is a phenomenon that typically occurs when agents are aware of their place in that system or they're aware of their being studied. So, for example, a psychologist who is studying people in a laboratory, those test subjects, the people who sign up for the psych study, they're going to behave a lot differently knowing that they're being watched than if they were just behaving by themselves. You yourself do things in private typically very differently than if someone was watching you. That's really important because that shows you that social systems exhibit reflexive properties. That is, when the agent is aware of their place in the social system that they're engaging in, that changes their behavior. It also changes their behavior when they are aware that other people are watching them. So those are two distinct things. To use some hopefully really intuitive examples, consider high art objects as values. So again, let's go back to Picasso, let's go back to Rembrandt, let's go to Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. These things have value because other people think they have value, and because we come to collectively agree that they have value. Look also at things like meme stocks. AMC, the theater company, GME, GameStop, Tesla, etc. A lot of these stocks have the incredible value that they do in terms of the share price because other people think that they have value, and in generating a value, that is the belief in value, that generates more value. And so as people buy more and more AMC stock, as people buy more GME stock, that tends to increase the share price, which makes the share price of that security a lot higher, which in turn leads to more speculation and investment into that stock, which increases the share price, and so on and so forth, until finally there's a bubble bursting and then it crashes. So that shows you that financial markets typically exhibit features of reflexivity, for example. And so the Hungarian billionaire George Soros, which many of you are probably familiar with, you may not have, however, been familiar with the fact that he did a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Philosophy of Science under the philosopher Karl Popper at the London School of Economics. And George Soros is important to our discussion because he promoted and widely publicized the notion of reflexivity amongst the general public, and especially in financial theory. So reflexivity was well known amongst Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, Auguste Comte, and other figures in the late 19th century and early 20th century in sociology theory, but it became much more popularized in finance and economics through the work of George Soros, the Hungarian billionaire. So Soros was very influential on academics trying to understand methodological issues in the social sciences in this sense. Finally, the last topic we're going to discuss today is the debate between reduction and emergence. So what does this mean? What this means is, consider, for example, the Stanley Cup riots in Vancouver. When those Stanley Cup riots happened 10 odd years ago, the question is, can you understand the Stanley Cup riots entirely on the basis of psychology and sociology? Or could you do it with even less assumptions? Maybe if you just knew physics, that physics itself, a physicist would be able to calculate the probability that people would riot, merely studying the system understood as a physical system as opposed to a social system. So what do I mean by this? You might be thinking to yourself, okay, wait, this is getting way too abstract. What are you talking about? Okay, it is abstract. It is complicated. So let's work through this slowly. So the basic thought is that physics is the fundamental structure of physical reality. It's atoms, electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, bosons, etc. It's quantum entanglement. It's all sorts of different kinds of effects, Lorentz transformation, Lorentz contraction in relativity. And these phenomena that occur in physical nature in turn determine, in some sense, according to some philosophers and according to some scientists, determine chemical relations between molecular bonds, covalent bond structures, for example, in the construction of H2O, sodium chloride, and otherwise known as table salt, all these sorts of things. So off of physics-based mathematical equations formulated in quantum field theory, non-relativistic quantum mechanics, general relativity, etc., these fields allow us to understand how it is the case that chemical bonds start to form and the behavior of matter understood in more macroscopic systems as opposed to subatomic systems. And so from this, at the level of chemistry in turn is supposed to determine, according to reductionists, is supposed to determine all biological relations. So cellular mitosis, for example, the Krebs cycle in your body, cellular regeneration, atrophy, all sorts of stuff, aging, dermatological issues with your skin, such as eczema, and those things in turn determine your neuronal behavior. And so the idea is that biology relies upon chemistry, and chemistry relies upon physics. And biology determines psychology, and psychology determines sociology, and sociology determines economics, and economics determines, culture or something like this. So you have this kind of hierarchy of the sciences. So this goes back to Auguste Comte's idea that social sciences are an extension of the natural sciences. And so reductionists in philosophy of social science believe that if you had sufficient enough data at the physics level or the chemical level or the biological level, you wouldn't even need the social sciences. That we would be able to fully reduce through mathematical methods and through artificial intelligence methods all of the behavior of humans, and all sociologists would be out of work, all psychologists would be out of work, all anthropologists would be out of work, if we could know all of the physical properties of each entity in the social system. So go back to the Stanley Cup riots. A highly abstract way to understand the Stanley Cup riots would be to take every mass of every single electron and particle of every single rioter, to look at the Hamiltonian governing the kinetic energy of the system from a physics perspective, calculate the time trajectory of that behavior, and predict the future point at which you could predict that, all of a sudden, these electrons are being excited, which are in turn exciting the neurons, which are in turn making people upset because the humans are coming to regard the phenomenon in front of them as a sport game, namely hockey, and they're coming to, in turn, regard the hockey game as being one where they lost, their home team lost to Vancouver Canucks, that caused them subsequently to riot. So that's a highly reductionist, physics-based approach, that kind of story I just gave you, as to how it is that a reductionist might come to see the social sciences. Hopefully that point is relatively clear from that example. So you get a philosopher like Don Ross, who's active in Ireland. He's a philosopher of social science who advocates a view known as ontic structural realism. And this view says that the only thing that actually exists in social reality is essentially mathematical structures and aspects of neuronal structure. So this is important because he doesn't believe in emergence in the same way that we intuitively believe in emergence. He actually thinks that if we were to know the initial inputs into the utility functions and other features of consumer behavior, understood mathematically using linear programming, for those who have taken an applied math course in economics, you know what I'm talking about, or Lagrange multiplier problems in supply and demand analysis, that you'd be able to see that and predict all the future behaviors of human beings. No need for things like beliefs, no need for things like notions of race, gender, etc. If we just somehow knew all these abstract mathematical structures that govern the behavior of human consumer preferences, we would be able to predict whether or not people buy Starbucks, whether or not people will use TikTok in a certain way, whether people will decide to sell real estate on a certain day. It's a highly abstract view. Okay, so I want to make this clear. It's not an intuitive view that Don Ross is advocating, but there are certain philosophers who do agree that it's just because we currently lack the data in physics and lack the data in biology and chemistry that we can't do this. That's the only thing stopping us, according to Don Ross. It's just an information problem. Similarly, you have someone like Alexander Wendt, and Alexander Wendt is a political scientist in, I believe it's Germany, at some German university, or some European university in any case. And he argues that you must have a monistic view about the sciences. That is, the social sciences must be compatible with and be, in some sense, fully integrated with the natural sciences. So even himself, as a political scientist interested in international relations theory, he actually advocates what he calls quantum social science. Now, I personally think this is an incredibly stupid idea, and that it's actually not well supported empirically, nor is it well supported philosophically. But he advocates, and it's a very interesting view, which is why I'm discussing it, and I want to do some charity here. It's a idea that quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics governs all physical phenomena at the absolute subatomic level, quantum mechanics therefore governs all of biology, which therefore governs all of psychology, which therefore governs all of sociology, which in turn governs all of politics. So Wendt is a hyper-reductionist who believes that, again, just like Don Ross, if only we had the relevant information, which he grants that in practice we can't ever have that, but if we could somehow measure all of the subatomic particles of every single entity on planet Earth, we'd be able to know the future dynamics, including politics. We would know whether or not Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan. We would know whether or not Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, will continue to increase interest rates in this calendar year. We'll know whether or not Ukraine will eventually join NATO. So Alexander Wendt truly believes this. He actually believes in quantum social science. He actually thinks that quantum mechanics could say, in theory, perhaps not in practice, something about social scientific behavior, whether it be in political science, whether it be in economic relations, whether it be in sociological relations, about class, race, and gender disputes. By way of contrast, remember the French sociologist I mentioned earlier in the early 20th century, Émile Durkheim. Émile Durkheim is someone who rejects all this. He thinks it's all bullshit. He thinks that emergence is really important. He thinks what's actually much more important is that entities at one level cannot be reduced to entities at a level lower. So, for example, I am a human being. I'm a Homo sapien, according to anthropologists and biologists. But I'm composed, obviously, of neurons and skin cells and all sorts of other cells in my body. But biologists can't fully understand my preferences for Amazon consumer products. An economist will know that better. And economics is operating at a much higher level of abstraction than the lower level of abstraction that biologists are operating under. So Émile Durkheim thinks that if you were to understand Amazon consumer preferences, it would be useless for you to spend too much time studying biology. You need to instead study sociology. You need to understand cultural theory. You need to understand behavioral economics. So consumer behavior, understood as a social phenomenon, even though consumer behavior could not happen without me having a brain, without me having mitosis in each of individual cells, without each of those individual cells acting on the covalent bond structure as a result of quantum chemistry, and those things being inoperable as a result, lacking operation as a result of quantum field theoretic properties pertaining to electron structure, et cetera, et cetera. Even though that's the case, you're not going to have a tractable model of Amazon consumer behavior according to Emil Durkheim, because there's emergent behavior happening at the social level that cannot be reduced to that of the physics story I just told you. So that shows you that these raging debates in social science, that practicing social scientists are happening all the time, and philosophers are happening all the time, as to whether or not these methods are effective, where you have reductionism or emergence. It shows you that there are real-world consequences for this. All right, guys, that was a whirlwind tour of the history and philosophy of social sciences. I hope you got something out of today's discussion. So just to kind of wrap it up, social science is super complex with a diversity of stakeholders. I hope that much is pretty obvious from the examples I've walked you through. There's significant political and subjective bias that enters into the models and assumptions of social scientific theories and policy decisions, and we need to mitigate that to the best we can. We can't always completely avoid it, but it's nonetheless there. And interdisciplinary research is really important because it presents the strengths and challenges of values, measurements, and goals that different stakeholders have in social phenomena. If you enjoyed this video, please consider watching other videos on this channel. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to try to get back to you. You can see my email in the description box. And I hope that this video helps you to think more critically about the social sciences. So stick around for more lectures on topics like race, cryptocurrencies, whether or not a science of happiness is possible, the limits of markets, misinformation on the internet. I will be talking about a wide variety of social scientific topics in the videos to come. All right, guys, have a great day, and I hope to see you at the next video.